Imagine standing on a quiet hill in the soft light of a long English evening. Below you in the valley sits a great grey castle, with thick stone walls and a square keep rising into the gentle dusk. The wind moves through the long grass. A few rooks lift from the battlements and circle slowly against a sky that is turning the colour of old roses. And as you look at this castle, you tell yourself the story that everyone has been told. You tell yourself that it was built for defence, that those high walls and deep ditches and heavy gates were raised to keep enemies out, that the men who poured their wealth and their lives into the stones did so because they were afraid and they needed somewhere strong to hide. That is the story we all grew up with. That is the story the guidebooks tell and the school lessons repeat, and the films and television series fix into our imaginations until we no longer question it. Castles, we say, were built for defence. But what if that simple story is not actually true? What if the real reason Britain covered itself in castles over a span of more than 500 years had almost nothing to do with defence in the way we usually understand the word? What if, in fact, the castle was never really a defensive structure at all, but something stranger and far more interesting? A theatre, a statement, a machine for ruling people. A house of administration dressed up in armour. A monument to power that happened, almost as an afterthought, to be able to withstand a siege. Tonight, in this long, slow journey through the British countryside, and through nearly 1,000 years of stone and silence, we are going to walk through that idea together. We are going to look at why castles were really built, who built them, and for whom, and against whom. We are going to peel back the comfortable old story of swords and arrows and gallant defenders. And underneath, we are going to find a quieter, stranger, and far more human truth. So settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the words become the soft rhythm under your sleep. There is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be, for the next 3 hours but here, with me, walking slowly through the stone history of these islands and the secret it has been carrying all this time. Before we go any further, if you are enjoying this slow journey through history, and you would like more nights like this one to drift into, please do take a quiet moment to subscribe to the channel and to leave a gentle like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it helps these long, slow stories find the other tired minds who need them. There is no rush, no music sting, no sudden burst of energy. Just the small kind act of subscribing, in the quiet, before we return to the castles and the long history of these islands. Thank you. And now, with that small kindness done, let us go back into the long story. Let us go back, in fact, to the very beginning, or near enough to the beginning, that the rest will make sense. We have to begin in the year 1066. Almost every story about British castles begins there, and for once, the cliché is correct. Before that year, the land we now call England did not really have castles in the sense we understand them. There were great hill forts left over from the Iron Age, soft green mounds where chieftains had once stood and watched their cattle. There were Roman walls in the cities and along the northern frontier, the long line of Hadrian's stones running across the high moors. There were Anglo-Saxon burhs, fortified towns ringed with earth ramparts and timber palisades, where the local people could shelter in times of trouble. There were monasteries with stone walls and quiet cloisters, and there were the great wooden halls of the Saxon thanes, long buildings of oak and thatch, where lords and their household warriors ate and drank and slept beside the same fire. But there were no castles, not in the sense that came later. Not the private stone fortress of a single lord, not the tower of dominance set in the middle of a town to overawe the people living there, not the great gatehouse rising over a portcullis, with murder holes above and arrow loops in the curtain wall. None of that existed yet. The land was wide and green and quiet, and it was ruled by a different idea of power, an older idea in which the king moved from hall to hall, eating his way around his own country, and the lords held their lands by personal loyalty and shared blood and the slow rhythm of seasons. Then the Normans came. They came across the grey sea from the long coast of northern France, in their lean ships with carved prows, and they landed on the beaches of the south coast on a still autumn day. They were led by a man called William, the Duke of Normandy, who would in time be remembered as William the Conqueror. He was a tough, intelligent, ruthless man, raised in a hard country where the rule of law was thin and the threat of violence was constant. He had crossed the sea because he believed the crown of England had been promised to him. And when his army met the army of the English King Harold on the slopes near a place called Hastings, the long battle that followed ended in the death of Harold and in the conquest of all England by a small foreign elite. Now, here is where the story turns. Because William and his Norman lords did not arrive with castles in their saddlebags, they did not bring stones across the sea. What they brought was an idea that they had been perfecting in Normandy for several generations. The idea was simple, and it was new, at least to the people of these islands. The idea was this: if you want to control a piece of land, you do not build a great wall around the whole town. You do not gather the people behind a shared rampart. You do not trust to the slow web of loyalty between lord and tenant and king. Instead, you choose a hill, or a river crossing, or a high spot above a market square, and you build, on that spot, your own private stronghold, a wooden tower on a great mound of earth, a small enclosed yard at the foot of the mound, ringed with a timber fence and a deep ditch. You move into that stronghold with your soldiers, and your horses, and your women, and your supplies. And from that stronghold, you rule the surrounding country. You ride out to collect taxes. You ride out to dispense justice. You ride out to take the harvest and the fattest cattle and the prettiest daughters and the strongest sons. And if the local people object, you ride out to break them. And then you ride back, behind your ditch, into your tower, where they cannot easily reach you. That is the original castle. That is what was new. Not a wall for the people, a wall for the Lord, against the people. From the moment the Normans understood that they had won at Hastings, they began to do this everywhere. Wherever they were given land, which was almost everywhere by the end of William's reign, they began to throw up these motte and bailey castles, as we now call them. The motte was the high mound with the wooden tower on top. The bailey was the lower enclosed yard at its foot, and these structures sprang up across the country at an astonishing speed. By some estimates, in the first 20 years after the conquest, between 500 and 1,000 of these little wooden castles were built across England and the Welsh borders. Imagine that. Imagine the sheer scale of the construction. Every few miles, in every county, a new mound was being heaped up by forced English labour. A new tower was being raised on top of it. A new Norman knight was moving in with his small armoured household. And the English people, who had until then lived in a country with almost no private fortifications at all, found themselves looking up, suddenly, at hundreds of small wooden citadels that had not existed in the time of their grandfathers. The land changed shape. The skyline changed. The very feeling of walking from one village to the next changed. Because now, almost everywhere, there was a castle. And in that castle there was a man who held you in his hand. Now think carefully about what this means. If these structures had really been about defense, against an external enemy, you would expect them to be concentrated on the coast or along the borders. You would expect them in places where invaders were likely to come from. You would expect a sensible strategic pattern. But that is not what we find. We find castles everywhere, in peaceful inland counties, in the middle of quiet farming country, in market towns that had never been attacked in living memory. We find them planted directly inside Anglo-Saxon settlements, often by destroying houses to make room for the mound. At York, for example, William ordered the destruction of dozens of homes inside the city walls in order to clear ground for not one, but two great castles, one on each side of the river. At Lincoln, 166 houses were levelled to make room for the new Norman castle on the hill. At Cambridge, 27 homes were swept away. The same story repeats itself across the country. Anglo-Saxon families, often poor families, were ordered out of their homes, and the houses were pulled down, and the timbers and the thatch and the smoke-stained beams were carted away, and in their place rose a great mound of raw earth and a high wooden tower from which a foreign lord could look down at what used to be a neighbourhood. Now, you do not do that if you are simply afraid of an invader. You do that for another reason entirely. You do that because you want the local population to see you, to look up every morning and see you, to never be able to forget that you are there. That is not defense. That is intimidation. That is, in modern language, occupation. The castle was, from the very beginning, the physical expression of a foreign elite holding down a conquered native population by force. And the first castles in England were therefore not the proud, heroic structures of legend. They were closer in spirit to the watchtowers that armies build in occupied territory in our own century. They were instruments of control, and the people who lived under them knew it. We can read the bitterness in the surviving fragments of Anglo-Saxon writing from the years after the conquest. In the chronicle written at the monastery at Peterborough, an anonymous monk poured out his grief at what had happened to his country. He wrote that the Normans had filled the land with castles, and that the castles were filled with devils and wicked men, and that the common people were tormented by them. He did not say that the castles defended his country. He said that they were the source of suffering in his country. That is the voice of the people who actually had to live under those first castles, not a voice of gratitude for protection, a voice of grief at oppression. So when we look up at the Green Mound at, say, Plechet in Essex, or at Cardiff, or at Oxford, or at any of the dozens of Motter and Bailey sites whose mounds still rise out of English fields, we are not looking at the ruins of brave defensive structures. We are looking at the surviving footprints of an occupation. The earliest castles in Britain were not built for defense. They were built for control. And once you understand that, almost everything else about the long story of British castles begins to make a different kind of sense. Let us follow that thread further. For the first 20 or 30 years after the conquest, the typical castle in England was still a wooden building. The moat was earth, but the tower on top was timber, often raised quickly in a few weeks by gangs of labourers. Timber was abundant in the great forests that still covered much of the country, and it was cheap, and a wooden castle could be put up in a single working season. This mattered because the Normans were spreading themselves very thinly across a country with a far larger native population. They could not afford to spend years building each stronghold. They needed quick, cheap, immediate dominance. Wood gave them that. But wood had its drawbacks. It rotted in the long, damp English winters. It burned, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. And, more importantly, it did not look permanent. A wooden tower might keep men out, but it spoke, even in its outline, of impermanence. It said, we might still be packed up and gone. And as the years went by, and the Norman lords settled deeper into their new English estates, that was not the message they wanted to send. They wanted to send the message that they were here forever, that their families would hold these lands not for a season, but for centuries, that the conquest was not a temporary visit, but a permanent settlement. And so, slowly at first, and then with growing momentum, the wooden towers began to be replaced by stone. And here we come to one of the most striking and most revealing of all the early Norman buildings. We come to the Tower of London. The tower stands today on the north bank of the Thames, just east of the old Roman city wall, in the part of London where the river bends towards the sea. It is one of the most visited buildings in the world. Millions of people walk through its gates every year. They come to see the crown jewels, the ravens, the beef-eaters in their red and gold tunics. They come because the tower has become, in the modern imagination, a kind of theme park of British history, a place where queens were beheaded and princes vanished and traitors carved their names into the stones of their cells. All of that is true, and all of that came later. But the tower was not built as a prison, and it was not built as a treasure house, and it was not built, in the simple sense, for defense. It was built for one reason above all others. It was built to terrify London. Let us go back and imagine the city as it was in the years immediately after the conquest. London, in 1066, was already an old city. It had been a Roman town. It had been an Anglo-Saxon trading port. By the time of the conquest, it was the largest and richest settlement in England, a place of merchants and ships and busy streets, ringed by the long line of the old Roman wall. Its people were Anglo-Saxons and Danes and a few foreigners, and they were, on the whole, not at all pleased about being conquered by the Normans. London had not been the site of the great battle at Hastings. London had not surrendered easily. There had been resistance, and there had been negotiation, and in the end, the city had accepted William as king, mostly because there was no realistic alternative. But the Londoners were proud, and they were rich, and they outnumbered the Normans by a vast margin. William knew that if the city ever decided to rise against him in earnest, his small foreign army would be in serious trouble. So he did what conquerors have always done when faced with a large and potentially hostile city. He built a fortress inside the city, at its most strategic point, and he stocked it with his own men, and he made it impossible for the people of the city to ignore it. The first version of what became the tower was thrown up quickly in the months after the conquest, probably a wooden structure built within the angle of the old Roman wall, on the riverside, where ships could reach it directly. But that first wooden tower was soon felt to be inadequate. London was too important, and the Normans wanted something more permanent, more visible, more terrible. And so, around the year 1078 or so, William ordered the building of a great stone keep. We call it the White Tower today, because at some later point it was lime-washed white. But for our purposes, what matters is its size and its purpose. The White Tower is a massive square block of stone, with walls 15 feet thick at the base, rising nearly 90 feet into the air, with 4 corner turrets. It was, when it was finished, by far the largest secular building in England. Nothing else in the country came close. The cathedrals were taller, of course, and the abbeys were grander in their own way, but for a private secular fortress, the White Tower was simply on a different scale to anything that had existed before. And here is the question: why so big? Why so tall? Why so massively constructed? London is not particularly vulnerable to invasion. By the time the White Tower was finished, William had been firmly in control of England for more than a decade. The country, while not exactly happy, was not in open revolt. There was no foreign army about to land on the Thames estuary. There was no need, in any conventional military sense, for a fortress of that scale to defend the city. The defensive arguments simply do not stretch to explain a building so enormous, so expensive, so deliberately overscaled. The answer becomes clear when you remember what we said earlier about castles and the people who lived under them. The tower was not built to defend London. It was built to dominate London. The Londoners walked past it every day on their way to the wharves. They saw it rising above the rooftops from every street in the eastern half of the city. When they looked east in the morning, the sun struck its walls and they could not look away. When they looked east at evening, its silhouette stood against the red sky like a vast clenched fist. It was, quite deliberately, the largest object in their world. And inside it lived a foreign king, and his soldiers, and his treasury, and his weapons. The message was as plain as a hand on the throat. If you behave yourselves, this building will leave you alone. If you do not, this building will pour out of its gates and break you. The Tower of London was, in the most literal sense, a piece of political theatre carved in stone. Its size was the message. Its location was the message. Even the choice to build it in the very corner of the city, against the river, so that it could be supplied and reinforced by sea, regardless of what the citizens did, was a message. The message was, you are not in control here. We are, and we are not going anywhere. This pattern, the great stone tower planted in the middle of a recently conquered urban population, was repeated again and again in those early Norman decades. At Colchester, in Essex, William ordered the building of another massive stone keep, this one even larger in plan than the White Tower, raised on the foundations of an old Roman temple to the deified Emperor Claudius. At Norwich, a great stone keep was set on a high mound in the very heart of the old Saxon town, with the cathedral in its shadow. At Rochester, at Newcastle, at Lincoln, at Carlisle, the same story unfolded. Big stone towers in important towns, always sited so that they could be seen from everywhere in the town, always sited so that they could be supplied from outside the town if the townspeople ever tried to cut them off, always vastly more elaborate and more expensive than any narrow defensive logic would require. Because the purpose was never narrow defense. The purpose was political domination, dressed up in stone. Now this is where we need to make a careful distinction. Castles were certainly used for defense. They were certainly fought over. There were sieges in the Norman period, and there were sieges throughout the long centuries that followed. We will come to some of those sieges in their turn. The walls did sometimes have to keep enemies out. The arrow loops were sometimes used by archers. The portcullis was sometimes dropped on attackers. None of that is in doubt. What is in doubt is whether defense was the original reason these buildings existed at all. And the evidence, when you look at it carefully, suggests that defense was always a secondary function. The primary function was to project the power of the lord who built it. The primary function was to administer the surrounding land. The primary function was to extract the wealth of the surrounding country in the form of food and rent and labor and military service, and to channel that wealth back into the hands of the man who owned the castle. The primary function, in other words, was political and economic, not military. The military function was real, but it was, you might say, a side effect. A castle that could not be easily taken was certainly useful in a crisis. But the same castle was useful every single day of the year after year, decade after decade, as a center of administration, justice, taxation, and display. And it is that everyday function, not the rare and dramatic siege, that explains why the castle as a form spread so quickly and so widely across these islands. Think of it like this. If you wanted to control a piece of land in the Norman period, you needed somewhere to put your representatives. You needed somewhere to hold the local court. You needed somewhere to store the rents that came in the form of grain and animals and salt and wool. You needed somewhere to imprison the offenders who had broken the Lord's peace. You needed somewhere to receive the messengers of the king or of the great barons. You needed somewhere to entertain other lords on their long progresses across the country. You needed, in effect, an office, a warehouse, a courthouse, a prison, a meeting hall, a hotel, and a residence, all in one. The castle, with its great hall and its kitchens and its chapel and its chambers and its storerooms and its dungeons, was that one combined building, and the high walls and gates were necessary, not so much because anyone was particularly likely to attack it, but because the people inside needed to be able to control who came in and who went out, who saw what, who waited where, who had access to the Lord and who did not. The walls were the membrane of a small state, defining where the Lord's direct jurisdiction began and ended. The gate was where you stepped from one kind of authority into another. The keep was the inner sanctum, where the most precious things were kept, including the Lord's own family, and where the most important decisions were made. The castle, in this view, was not a fortress at all. It was a small government complex, with a fortress wrapped around it for good measure. And once you see that, the long, strange, beautiful story of British castle building begins to look entirely different. It begins to look like a story not about war, but about rule, not about defense, but about domination, not about keeping enemies out, but about keeping power in. And we have only just begun. Let us walk, then, into one of these castles, in our imagination, on an ordinary morning in the 12th or 13th century. We are not going to pick a famous one. We are not going to choose a castle that anyone has heard of. We are going to choose, instead, a middling sort of castle, the kind that existed in their hundreds across the country. A castle belonging to a baron of moderate importance. A castle in a quiet shire, far from any border, far from any port, far from any place where an enemy is at all likely to appear. The kind of castle whose ruin you might walk past today on a country footpath without giving it a second thought. We come to the gate at the hour after dawn. The air is cool and grey. There is dew on the long grass beyond the ditch. The drawbridge is already down, because this castle has, in truth, only rarely had to draw its bridge in earnest. The portcullis is up. The great wooden gates stand open, but a porter sits beside them on a stool, with a club at his elbow and a horn round his neck, and he watches everyone who comes and goes. We pass into the courtyard, which is busier than you might expect. There are men leading horses to a trough. There is a boy with a load of firewood on his shoulder. There is a woman in a coarse grey apron, scattering grain to a small crowd of hens. There is the smell of smoke and stables and bread baking somewhere out of sight. Against the inner wall, there is a stack of barrels, and on top of one of them, a man in a leather jerkin is making a tally on a slip of parchment, marking each barrel with a piece of charcoal as he counts them. This is not a fortress in the simple sense. This is a small working settlement, busy with the ordinary tasks of a small working settlement. Across the courtyard rises the great stone keep, and inside the keep, on the first floor up above the ground, is the great hall. The great hall is the centre of everything. It is where the Lord holds court in both senses of the word. It is where he eats and where he judges and where he meets visitors and where, in the long evenings, he and his household sit together by the fire and listen to a harper or a singer. It is a long, high room with thick walls and small windows and a great open hearth in the middle of the floor with the smoke rising up into the high beams and out through louvres in the roof. The floor is strewn with rushes, mixed with herbs to sweeten the air. There are wooden trestles down the sides of the hall, with benches alongside where the household will eat. At one end, on a low platform, sits the high table, where the lord and his lady and their most important guests will eat, raised above the rest so that all the household can see them. This is the everyday theatre of lordship. The high table is a stage. The lord sits in the middle, with his lady beside him, and the lesser members of the household sit further and further down the hall in strict order of importance, until at the very bottom, near the door, the lowest servants and the visiting hangers-on take their meals on the rough end of the trestles. Everyone in the hall knows exactly where they sit. Everyone knows exactly what that seating means about their place in the world. The hall is, in this sense, a kind of moving diagram of the social order, with the Lord at its head and everyone else arranged below him in descending degrees of nearness to power. And the castle exists, in part, to make this daily theatre possible. The hall needs to be big enough to hold the household. It needs to be impressive enough to overawe visitors. It needs to be defended enough to make the Lord feel safe within it, even when he is surrounded by men whose loyalty cannot always be taken for granted. The hall is the heart of the castle, and the castle exists, in large part, to wrap that hall in walls. But the hall is not the only important room. Behind the high table, there is usually a door, and that door leads to a smaller, more private chamber, sometimes called the solar, sometimes called the chamber, sometimes by other names. This is the Lord's private room, where he sleeps, where his wife sleeps, where his most private business is conducted. The solar is generally smaller and warmer than the hall, with a private fireplace, and with windows that may have been glazed at some considerable expense. Glazed windows in the 12th century were a serious luxury. Most windows in most buildings were closed with wooden shutters or with thin sheets of horn. Glass was rare and expensive, and a sign of real wealth. The Lord's private chamber, with its glazed window and its tapestries and its small fire, was a deeply comfortable space by the standards of the age, and it was the kind of comfort that no peasant or even prosperous freeman would ever know in his life. The castle, you see, was not just a centre of power, it was also a centre of comfort. It was a place where the Lord could live in a degree of warmth and privacy and beauty that was simply unavailable anywhere else in his domain. The peasants in their long houses shared their single room with their animals and with the smoke of their fire. The freemen in their farmhouses were a step up from this, but still lived rough by any modern measure. Even the parish priest in his small stone vicarage rarely had a glazed window or a private chamber. Only the Lord, in his castle, had real privacy. Only the Lord had heated rooms and tapestries and a soft bed with curtains around it. The castle, then, was the most comfortable house in the district, and the most beautiful, and the most full of fine things. It was the only place in the parish where a man could close a door behind him and be alone. That alone made it a kind of paradise compared with the rest of the medieval world, and it tells us something about the role of the castle. The castle was, among other things, the Lord's home, and his home had to be defended, yes, but it also had to be lived in, comfortably, by him and his wife and his children and his most trusted servants. The Lord did not spend most of his life waiting to be besieged. He spent most of his life eating, talking, sleeping, riding, hunting, hawking, praying, settling disputes, signing documents, and entertaining guests. The castle had to support all of that, and so the Great Keep, which we so often imagine as a grim military structure, was in fact full of rooms that had nothing to do with war. There were storerooms in the basement for grain and wine and salted meat. There was a chapel with painted walls and a small altar where the Lord and his household heard Mass every morning. There were latrines, often quite cleverly designed, with stone chutes leading down through the thickness of the wall into a pit or a stream below. There were guard rooms, certainly, and storerooms for weapons, but these were a small part of the whole. Most of the keep was given over to ordinary domestic life, lived at a scale and with a level of comfort that no one else in the surrounding country could match. Now, alongside the Lord's house, the castle also had to function as a centre of administration. The Lord was not just a landlord. He was, in the structure of medieval England, a small unit of government. He held the king's writ over the people on his lands. He held the court that settled disputes between his tenants. He collected the taxes and dues that flowed up, eventually, to the crown. He raised soldiers when the king called for them. He kept the peace in his corner of the country. And all of that required paperwork, although the word paper is not quite right, because the documents of the early medieval period were written on parchment, the prepared skin of sheep and calves. The castle, therefore, had to be a place where parchments could be stored and where clerks could write them. Almost every castle of any importance had at least one clerk, often a priest, who could read and write Latin, and who kept the Lord's accounts and drew up his documents. The clerk worked in a small room with a sloping desk, with quills and ink and a chest of parchments. The chest was usually iron-bound and locked. The documents inside it were among the most valuable things the Lord possessed, because they were the written record of his land, his rights, his obligations, his debts. Without them, his power was much less secure. With them, he could go to any court in the land, including the king's own court, and prove that this field, this manor, this market, this advowson of a parish church belonged to him. The castle was where those documents were safe. The castle was, in effect, the registry office, the tax office, and the records office of the local administration. It was, in a quite literal sense, where the government of the district was kept. Add to this its function as a court of justice. Manorial courts were held in the great hall of the castle. The lord, or a steward acting for him, sat as judge. Tenants brought their disputes about boundaries, disputes about straying cattle, disputes about inheritance, disputes about marriages and debts and small assaults. The Lord's word, in most of these cases, was final. Appeals to higher courts were possible in theory, but expensive in practice. For most people, most of the time, the Lord in his castle was the law, and the castle, with its hall and its gate and its stone walls, gave that legal authority a physical shape. When a man was summoned to the Lord's court, he had to walk through the castle gate to get there. He had to pass through the same physical threshold that armies, in theory, might have to fight their way through. The thresholds of justice were the same thresholds as the thresholds of war. Justice and war wore the same clothes. The castle was where both of them lived, and that double character, half courthouse and half fortress, is one of the most important things to understand about what a castle was for. The walls did not exist only to keep enemies out. They existed to give a particular kind of authority, a particular kind of shape. They said, when you come here, you come to a different kind of place. You come to the place where the Lord is in command. You come to the place where the king's writ runs through the Lord's mouth. You come to the place where the world is no longer ordinary, no longer common, no longer your own. And that is a defensive structure, perhaps, in the broadest sense of the word. But it is not a defense against an enemy. It is defense of a hierarchy. It is defense of an arrangement of power. It is defense of a way of life. We will see, as the story goes on, that this is the deeper truth about every castle ever built. They were not really built to keep enemies out. They were built to keep power in. If you really want to see the truth of what castles were for, You cannot stay in the English Midlands. You have to go west. So you have to follow the long old roads that climb up into the hills and then drop down into the broad green valleys of Wales. Because it is in Wales, at the end of the 13th century, that the castle reaches the highest point of its development as an instrument of political domination. And it is in Wales that the gap between the comfortable old story of defence and the harder truth of conquest becomes most obvious. To understand what happened in Wales, we have to go back a little and remember what kind of country Wales was in, the early medieval period. Wales was not a single kingdom. It was a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and principalities ruled by Welsh princes who could trace their descent back to the old Romano-British nobility of the Western Mountains. The Welsh spoke a different language from the English. They had different laws, the laws of Hywel Dda, a body of customary law that was in many ways more humane and more sophisticated than the laws of England. They had a different system of inheritance, in which land was divided among all the sons rather than passing to the eldest. They had different traditions of poetry and music and storytelling, and they had a fierce sense of themselves as a separate people, the original inhabitants of the island, the descendants of the men who had been here before the Saxons came. After the Norman conquest of England, the Welsh princes were sometimes at peace with the English crown and sometimes at war, but for 200 years they kept a real degree of independence. Norman barons established themselves along the Welsh border, the so-called Marcher lordships, with their own castles at places like Chepstow and Ludlow and Hereford. These Marcher lords ran their own small kingdoms within the Kingdom of England, more or less independent of the king, and they fought the Welsh princes for control of the lower valleys and the river crossings. But the high country, the mountains of Snowdonia, and the wild lands of mid-Wales remained Welsh. Then, in the late 13th century, a king came to the English throne who decided that this divided arrangement could not continue. His name was Edward I, and he was a hard, intelligent, deeply ambitious man, in some ways the most formidable English king of the Middle Ages. Edward had grown up in a court where his father had been weak, and his barons had often been in revolt. He had spent years putting down rebellions and bringing the English baronage to heel. By the time he turned his attention to Wales, he was a king who knew his own mind and a king who had the resources of a centralized English state behind him. He was determined to bring Wales fully under the English crown. The trigger for the final war came in 1277, when the Welsh prince Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, who had been recognized as Prince of Wales by Edward's father, refused to pay homage to the new king. Edward marched a great army into Wales, and Llywelyn was forced to submit. But the war was not yet over. A few years later, Llywelyn's brother Dafydd rebelled, and Llywelyn himself joined in. The Second Welsh War began in 1282 and ended in 1283 with the death of Llywelyn in a small skirmish on a hillside near Builth Wells and the execution of Dafydd at Shrewsbury. With the deaths of the last princes, the independence of Wales was over. Edward had won. Now, the question was, what to do with this newly conquered country? Edward did not, as the Normans had done in England, simply parcel out the land among his lords and let them get on with it. He had a more systematic plan. He intended to bind Wales into the English crown forever, in a way that no Welsh rising could undo. And the centrepiece of that plan was a programme of castle building, so vast, so ambitious, and so expensive that it nearly bankrupted the English crown. We call it today the Iron Ring. It is a chain of great stone castles strung along the North Welsh coast, from Flint in the east through Rhuddlan, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and Beaumaris, with a few others further south at Aberystwyth and elsewhere. These castles were not built quickly. They were built slowly, over years, by armies of labourers, brought in from all over England, supervised by a brilliant French-speaking architect named James of St. George, who had previously worked for Edward in Savoy and who knew how to design the most up-to-date fortifications in Europe. James of St. George brought to Wales the latest ideas in military architecture, ideas drawn from the Crusader castles in the Holy Land and from the great cities of the Mediterranean. His designs were studied, precise, and beautiful. They were also enormously expensive. At Caernarfon, the building works went on for decades, and even when Edward died in 1307, the castle was not yet finished. At Beaumaris, on the island of Anglesey, the works were begun in the 1290s and never fully completed at all, although enough of it was built to function. The total cost of these castles, in the money of the day, has been estimated at something like £80,000, which was several times the annual royal income. Edward was, in effect, pouring everything he had into stone in North Wales. Now ask yourself the question we have been asking all evening. Why? Why so much? Why so big? Why so beautiful? Why so far? If these castles were simply about defence against a Welsh enemy, the scale and the cost are very hard to explain. The Welsh princes were dead. Their armies had been broken. The free Welsh population that remained was scattered through the high valleys, with no fortresses of their own, no siege engines, no real means of mounting a sustained military campaign. A modest network of small forts and garrisoned towers would have been more than enough to hold the country in any narrow military sense. But Edward did not build a modest network. He built a chain of vast, palatial, breathtakingly elaborate castles, each one a masterpiece of stone, each one more impressive than the last. The defensive argument, as a complete explanation, simply collapses. Once again, we have to look for the real answer somewhere else. And once again, the answer lies in the realm of theatre, of statement, of intimidation. These castles were built to be the new Welsh capitals of an English Wales. They were the centres of English government in the conquered country. And they were also, deliberately and unmistakably, statements of the absolute supremacy of the English crown over the Welsh people. Look at the way they are sited. They are not in the high mountains, where the last Welsh resistance might have hidden. They are on the coast, at the mouths of the great rivers, at the points where ships could come and go and resupply them from England. They are sited so that the English could always reach them, even if the surrounding country was hostile. They are sited so that the Welsh, who lived inland in the high valleys, would have to come down to them, into the open lowlands, into the shadow of their walls, to do any business with the new administration. The Welsh were being pulled, in effect, out of their mountain heartland and into the orbit of these new coastal fortresses. The geography of power was being rewritten. Look, too, at the way they were attached to new towns. Almost every one of these castles was built next to a new walled town, founded at the same time, populated deliberately with English settlers, brought in from England, and given trading privileges that the Welsh themselves were forbidden to share. At Conwy, the Welsh were actually moved out of the old settlement of Aberconwy, where there had been a monastery and a small town, so that the English could build their new town inside the new walls. At Caernarfon, the same pattern. At Beaumaris, the same again. These were colonial towns in the most literal sense. They were planted on Welsh soil by an English king, populated by English settlers, ringed by English walls, and protected by English castles, with the explicit purpose of dominating the surrounding Welsh population. The castle and the town worked together. The town drew the trade of the surrounding country into a place where English merchants controlled it. The castle stood beside the town, brooding over it, providing the military backing that made the colonial arrangement possible. And the whole package was, you might say, a kit, an imperial kit. Edward and his men had worked out a formula for occupying and colonizing a conquered country, and they were applying that formula systematically across North Wales. The castles were the strongholds, the new towns were the settlements. The new English boroughs took over the local trade. The Welsh, in the meantime, were pushed inland, taxed, regulated, watched. They were, in their own country, made strangers, and nowhere is this colonial purpose more clearly written than at Caernarfon itself. We have to spend a little time at Caernarfon, because it is, in many ways, the perfect example of what we have been describing. Caernarfon sits at the western end of the Menai Strait, where the narrow channel between Anglesey and the mainland opens into the sea. It is a place that had been important for 2,000 years. The Romans had built a fort here, called Saguntium, on the hill above the modern town. The Welsh had had a court here, near the same spot. Whoever controlled Caernarfon controlled the mouth of one of the most important crossings in Wales. Edward chose Caernarfon as the capital of his new English Wales. He intended it to be the seat of his administration, the place where royal government would sit, the symbolic centre of his conquered country, and he intended the castle there to look the part. Now, look at Caernarfon Castle, even today, in its ruined state, and you will see something strange. You will see something that is not just a fortress. You will see a building that is trying to say something. The walls are not the round, towered, slightly austere walls of the other castles in the chain. They are decorated with bands of different coloured stone, alternating layers of light and dark. The towers are not all round. The most prominent of them, the Great Eagle Tower at one end of the castle, is polygonal, with multiple sides. And the overall effect, when you stand outside it and look up, is of a building that resembles, more than anything, the walls of the great city of Constantinople, the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. This is not an accident. This is deliberate. Edward and his architect were borrowing the language of Imperial Rome and Byzantium in stone on a hillside in North Wales. They were saying, this is not just a castle, this is the seat of an empire. The man who sits in this castle is not just an English king visiting his lands. He is the heir of the Roman emperors, the lord of a great state, the rightful ruler of these islands. And by sitting here, in this Roman style, with this Roman scale, in this Roman colour scheme of striped stone, he is reminding the world that the conquest of Wales is not a temporary affair. It is a return to the proper order of things. It is the empire reasserting itself over its forgotten western province. That is the message of Caernarfon. And it could not be more obviously a political message, rather than a defensive one. A castle built purely for defence would not waste the time and the money on banded stonework. It would not bother with the polygonal eagle tower. It would use the cheapest, strongest, most efficient design available. But Caernarfon is not cheap, not efficient, not minimal. It is theatrical, it is symbolic. It is, if you like, an imperial poem in stone, and it tells us, perhaps more clearly than any other castle in Britain, what these buildings were really for. And there is one more thing about Caernarfon that we have to mention, because it captures the theatrical nature of these castles so completely. In April of the year 1284, while the castle was still being built, Queen Eleanor of Castile, the wife of Edward I, gave birth to a son inside the unfinished walls. The boy was named Edward, after his father, and he would grow up to become King Edward II of England. The birth of an English prince at Caernarfon, in the very heart of the just conquered Welsh country, was not an accident of timing. Eleanor had travelled deliberately to Wales in the late stages of her pregnancy. She had been brought to Caernarfon, of all the places in her husband's domains, to bear the future king. The symbolism was meant to be obvious. The future of England, the next generation of the royal family, would be born on Welsh soil, in the new English capital, inside the new English castle. And then later, when the boy had grown up a little, his father took the further step of formally creating him Prince of Wales, the first English Prince of Wales, taking the title that had belonged to the dead Welsh princes and binding it forever to the English royal heir. From that day to this, the title of Prince of Wales has been given to the heir to the British throne, and the long line stretches all the way back to a child born in a half-built castle on a hill above the Menai Strait in 1284. The whole performance was political theatre at its most refined. The castle was the stage. The newborn prince was the prop. The Welsh, watching from the cottages of the surrounding country, were the unwilling audience. And the play being performed, in stone and in flesh, was the play of conquest. Now, look around Caernarfon and you can still feel some of this. The town walls run from the castle down to the harbour and back, ringing the original English settlement. The Welsh, for centuries, were forbidden to live or to trade inside those walls. They could come into the market on certain days, under certain conditions, but they could not own property within the borough. The town was a closed English colony, planted in Welsh land, with the castle as its anchor. The geography of segregation was written into the stones, and the same arrangement with small variations, was repeated at Conwy and at Beaumaris and at Flint. Each of these places had a similar plan: a castle, a walled town beside it, an English population inside the walls, a Welsh population pushed out into the surrounding country. The castle was not just defending a piece of ground, it was holding open the space inside which a colonial society could grow. Without the castles, the English settlement could not have survived. The castles were not the defense of an existing English presence. The castles were the precondition of an English presence. And once you see that, you see how completely they functioned as instruments of conquest. They did not protect anybody. They created the situation that needed protecting. They were not the response to a problem. They were the cause of a problem. And they were, deliberately and consciously, designed to be permanent. Edward did not expect his castles to be tested in regular sieges. He expected them, on the contrary, to make Welsh resistance impossible in the first place. He expected the sheer scale of these buildings to break the Welsh spirit. He expected the Welsh, looking up at Caernarfon and at Conwy and at Harlech, to understand that they could never go back, that there was no possibility of restoring their old kingdoms, that the conquest was final, because here, in stone, was the proof of how serious the English crown was about staying. That was the message. And the castles, in their bulk and their beauty and their cost, were the medium for the message. Of course, the Welsh did not entirely accept this message. There were Welsh risings against the English in the 14th century. The most famous of them was the Great Rebellion of Owain Glyndwr, which began in 1400 and went on for almost 15 years. Glyndwr's men besieged several of Edward's castles and held some of them for long periods. At Harlech, in particular, the castle fell to Glyndwr and became, for a few years, his actual headquarters and the seat of his Welsh parliament. So the castles were tested, and some of them were taken, and the Iron Ring was in the end not quite as unbreakable as Edward had hoped. But even so, the long-term effect of those castles was exactly what Edward had intended. The English crown kept hold of Wales. The colonial towns grew slowly into ordinary Welsh towns, with mixed populations. The Welsh language survived in the countryside and in the chapels, but the English language took over in the law courts and the markets. And the great castles, after the political crises of the late Middle Ages were over, slowly settled into their long second life as monuments. Today you can stand on the walls of Conwy and look out over the river to the mountains beyond, and you can hardly believe that this beautiful place was built as an act of conquest. It is so picturesque. It is so much loved. It is so deeply photographed and painted and remembered. The tourists who come here in their thousands every summer do not feel that they are walking through an instrument of colonial domination. They feel that they are walking through a fairy tale. But that softening of memory is itself a part of the story. The castles were so successful as instruments of long-term political control that the political control eventually became invisible. The conquest became the normal state of affairs. The colonial towns became simply Welsh towns. The English crown became, in time, the British crown, and Wales became, in time, a fully integrated part of a larger British identity. And the castles, having done their work, were free to be admired as architecture, as scenery, as romance. That is one of the most striking things about castles in general. Their success makes their original purpose disappear. When a castle works, in the long-term political sense, it stops looking like what it really is and starts looking like what we want it to be. A fortress for our imagination, a backdrop for our weddings and our films, a place where our children can run up the spiral staircases and look out from the battlements and pretend to be knights and princesses. The blood and the resentment and the tax records and the manacles in the cellar all fade away, leaving only the beautiful stones. And the beautiful stones are, in their way, the final and most elegant proof of how effectively the castle did its real job. The Welsh castles built by Edward I are perhaps the clearest example of a castle as colonial instrument. But the pattern is not unique to Wales. It repeats in slightly different forms in other parts of the British Isles, and indeed across the wider Norman world. Wherever a conquering elite had to hold down a conquered population over the long term, the castle was the tool of choice. We see it in Ireland, where Norman lords from the late 12th century onwards built castles like Trim and Carrickfergus and Roscrea, planting themselves in the green Irish countryside as a kind of armoured aristocracy living above the Gaelic population. We see it in the Scottish lowlands, where the medieval kings of Scots built castles like Edinburgh and Stirling, and where their barons built lesser fortresses across the country, in part to control a population that was itself a mixture of Gaels and Scots and Norse and English. We see it in the marches between England and Wales, where the great chain of castles like Ludlow and Goodrich and Chepstow and Caerphilly marked the line where English law shaded into Welsh resistance. Everywhere the Normans and their successors went, they built castles. And everywhere they built castles, the castles served the same primary purpose. They held a territory for its new masters. They projected power into the surrounding country. They provided a base from which administration, justice, and taxation could be carried on. And they did all of this, generally, without needing to be put under siege at all. The mere existence of the castle was usually enough. The shadow of the keep was almost always more important than the keep itself. Now, this point is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it goes to the heart of what we are trying to understand. A castle does not need to actually keep an enemy out in order to be effective. A castle is effective if the people in the surrounding country believe that it could keep an enemy out if it had to. The deterrent effect is the real effect. The castle is doing its job not when it is being attacked, but when it is not being attacked, because everyone knows that attacking it would be hopeless. The castle is, in this sense, a kind of standing argument. Every day that it stands there, with its walls and its banners and its watchmen, it is making the argument that resistance is futile. Every day that no one in the surrounding country tries to challenge the lord who lives in it, that argument is winning. And the argument, when it wins, is invisible. There is no battle. There is no siege. There is no dramatic story to tell. There is only a long, quiet, undisturbed succession of years in which taxes flow up and obedience flows down, and the castle sits there, on its hill, being beautiful and being terrible at the same time. That is the castle doing what it was really built for. And by that measure, almost every castle in Britain has been a success. Most of them were never seriously besieged in their working lives. Most of them never saw an enemy at the gate. Most of them, instead, simply sat in the landscape, year after year, generation after generation, doing the slow work of binding a piece of country into the rule of the lord who owned them. And when eventually the political world changed around them, and the rule of lords gave way to the rule of parliaments and the rule of bureaucracies, the castles were left standing, with their work mostly done, ready to be admired as monuments. We will see, in time, how that long change came about, and what the castles became when their original purpose was lost. But first, we have to spend more time inside them, in their working years, and we have to understand the daily texture of life within their walls, because the castle was not only a political idea, it was also a place where real people lived, and ate, and worked, and dreamed. Let us return, then, to the imagined castle we were walking through earlier, and let us push deeper into its everyday life. The castle, remember, is not really a fortress. It is a small armoured town, ruled by a lord, occupied by a household that may run to anywhere between a few dozen and several hundred people, depending on the wealth of the family who owns it. The largest castles, in their working prime, supported populations bigger than many villages. The household was a small society, with its own ranks and offices and customs, and it spent most of its time on the very ordinary business of feeding itself, and clothing itself, and entertaining itself, and serving the man at its head. At the top of the household, of course, was the lord, and beside him, his lady. The lady of the castle was, in the way the medieval world worked, not just a wife, but a kind of co-manager of the establishment. When the lord was away on the king's business, or on his other estates, which could be for months at a time, the lady ran the castle in his absence. She supervised the household, settled domestic disputes, ordered supplies, received visitors, sometimes presided over the manorial court in her own person. The image we have inherited from later romance of the medieval lady as a passive and decorative figure waiting on a tower for her lord to come home is largely a Victorian invention. The real lady of a real castle was, more often, a working executive, and her power within the four walls of the keep was considerable. Below the lord and his lady came the chief officers of the household. These men, and they were almost always men, formed a kind of cabinet of senior administrators. There was the steward, sometimes also called the seneschal, who was the chief manager of the household and the estates. The steward was, in effect, the lord's prime minister. He represented the lord's authority when the lord was absent, and he was responsible for the running of everything from the household budgets to the manorial courts. He was usually a knight or a man of equivalent rank, a person of real standing in his own right, who had taken service with the lord in exchange for fees that could be quite substantial. Beside the steward was the chamberlain, who was responsible for the lord's chamber, his private rooms, his clothes, his jewels, his most personal possessions. The chamberlain was a position of intimate trust. He had access to the lord at all hours, knew his secrets, handled his money. Then there was the butler, who in the early medieval sense was not a Victorian Edwardian gentleman's gentleman, but the officer in charge of the lord's wine and ale, the bottles in the cellar, the casks in the buttery. Wine, in particular, was a luxury that had to be imported from France or Spain or the Rhineland, and it represented a serious investment of money. The butler protected that investment. Then there was the marshal, who was responsible for the lord's horses and stables, and for the military side of the household, the men at arms who guarded the castle and rode with the lord on his journeys. And there was the constable, who in many great castles was a senior officer, charged with overall command, especially in royal castles where he answered directly to the crown rather than to a private lord. The constable of a royal castle was a person of national importance. The constable of the Tower of London, for example, was one of the great officers of the realm. Below these chief officers came a great mass of lesser servants. There were yeomen and grooms in the stables. There were pages and squires, often young men of good family, who were learning the trade of knighthood by serving in a great household. There were clerks in the muniment room. There were cooks and undercooks and scullions in the kitchen. There were laundresses and seamstresses and women who looked after the ladies' clothes. There were carpenters and masons and smiths who kept the buildings in repair. There were falconers who looked after the lord's hawks. There were huntsmen who looked after his dogs. There were sometimes a priest or two, with their own clerks. There were boys whose job it was to turn the spit in the kitchen all day long, for hours, while the meat roasted before the fire. There were men who did nothing all year but keep the stocks of firewood at the right level. The household, in other words, was a complex working community, with a wide range of skills and responsibilities, and it had to be fed, housed, paid, supervised, and kept in some kind of order. The castle had to support all of that. The kitchens of a great castle were astonishing places. They were often huge, with several fireplaces large enough to roast a whole ox at once. The kitchen at Glastonbury Abbey, although strictly speaking a monastic kitchen rather than a castle kitchen, gives some idea of the scale. It is a square stone building with 4 enormous fireplaces, one in each corner, each with its own great chimney and a high vaulted roof. The kitchens of great castles like Kenilworth or Caerphilly or Dover would have been similar in scale, though usually built into the line of the inner buildings rather than as a separate structure. The reason for the size was simple. When the lord was in residence, the kitchen had to feed the whole household every day, sometimes 3 meals a day, and on great occasions, when guests had been invited, several hundred extra people. The output on a feast day could run to dozens of dishes, with great roasts and stews and pies and tarts, all prepared by hand, all coordinated by a head cook, who had to manage the timing of the whole operation. The cooks worked in heat that would be considered unsafe today. They worked over open fires, with hot fat and boiling water, and heavy iron pots and roaring chimneys, surrounded by sharp knives and live flames, and small boys running back and forth, with armfuls of vegetables and trays of bread. Accidents happened often. Fires happened often, Hands were burnt and feet were scalded, and from time to time a whole castle had to be partly rebuilt because the kitchen had gone up in a blaze that could not be controlled. The food itself was, by modern standards, sometimes wonderful and sometimes terrible. The lord and his immediate family ate well. They had access to roasted meat almost every day, often several kinds at the same meal. They had fresh fish in seasons when fishing was possible, brought in from the coast or from local rivers. They had bread of fine white wheat flour. They had wine. They had fruits in their seasons. They had exotic spices that had travelled across the world to reach them, peppers and cloves and ginger and saffron, all of them very expensive, all of them used in lavish quantities at a great table as a way of displaying wealth. The cooks of a great household competed to make dishes that looked impressive as well as tasting good. Birds were roasted and then dressed again in their own feathers so that they appeared on the table looking as if they were alive. Pies were baked with live birds inside so that when they were cut open, the birds flew out across the hall, to general amazement. Sugar, which was a great rarity and was thought to have medicinal properties, was moulded into elaborate sculptures called subtleties, often shaped like castles or like ships or like religious scenes, and these subtleties were carried in procession to the high table at the climax of the meal. The dining table of the lord was in effect a kind of stage where the wealth and refinement of the household could be paraded before the household and before the guests. Eating in a great medieval castle was a performance, and the rituals of eating were carefully maintained. The lord's hands were washed by a senior servant before the meal began. Water poured from a fine silver ewer into a silver basin and then dried with a soft linen cloth. Grace was said by the chaplain. The food was carried in by serving men in formal order, often with trumpets and other instruments to announce the arrival of each course. The lord was served first, then his lady, then his most important guests, then the rest of the high table, and so down through the household in declining rank, until the lowest pages were eating the scraps in the corner. Wine was poured by the butler or his deputy. Bread was broken from large round loaves and used, in many households, in place of plates, the wine's sodden ends being given afterwards to the beggars at the gate. Yes, there were beggars at the gate. A great household had to maintain a tradition of public charity, partly out of religious obligation and partly because it was good for the lord's reputation, and so a portion of every meal was reserved for the poor who came each day to the gate. Old soldiers, widows of tenants, travellers without money, lepers from the local hospital, all of these came to the gate at certain hours, and the porter doled out bread and broth and whatever scraps the kitchen had to spare. The lord, sitting at his high table, was performing not only wealth but also Christian generosity, and the beggars at the gate were a necessary part of that performance. Below stairs, of course, the servants ate their own meals, which were simpler but still substantial. There was usually enough food to go round, and the diet of a household servant in a well-run castle was probably better in terms of calories and protein than the diet of most peasants on the surrounding manors. To work in the lord's household was, by the standards of the time, a comparatively good life. You were warm in winter, you had a roof over your head, you ate every day, you wore clothes that the lord had provided, usually in his livery colours, with his badge embroidered on the breast. You belonged to something, you had a place in the great pyramid of medieval society, and all of this domestic life happened inside the walls of the castle, inside walls that we keep being told were built for defence. But, as you can see by now, they were also built to enclose this whole way of life, to create a space inside which a particular kind of community, with its hierarchies and its rituals and its strange beauty, could carry on. The walls were not just keeping enemies out, they were keeping a world in. And that world, the small armoured world of the medieval household, was as much the reason for the castle as any military consideration. Now let us step back outside the walls and look at the castle again from a distance. In the quiet light of a country evening, we have walked through its rooms and watched its household at work. We know now what was happening inside. But to see the castle properly, we have to remember that the people of the medieval countryside, the people who lived under it and around it, did not get to walk through its rooms. They saw only the outside. They saw the walls and the towers and the great gatehouse and the banners that flew from the high points. And what they saw, more than anything else, was a kind of advertisement. The medieval world was a world full of visual messages. People could not read, in most cases. Books were rare and expensive and largely confined to the educated clergy. News did not travel by newspaper or by leaflet. It travelled instead by sight and by speech. And in a world where most people could not read, the visible symbols on the outside of a great building were tremendously important. They were how a building told the world who owned it, who lived there, what their history was, what their claims were, who their friends and enemies were. The exterior of a castle was, in this sense, a kind of giant billboard, designed to be read by people who could not read words. Take the gatehouse, for example. In the early castles of the 11th and 12th centuries, the gatehouse was a fairly simple affair, a pair of strong wooden doors, perhaps with a passage between two flanking towers, perhaps with a portcullis or a drawbridge. The gate was a piece of military engineering designed to be defended in case of attack. But over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, gatehouses became something much more elaborate. They grew taller. They grew more decorated. They began to bear stone carvings of heraldic devices, the personal symbols of the lord who lived inside. They became, in effect, a kind of frontispiece for the whole castle, a place where the lord could announce himself to anyone approaching. The gatehouse of a castle in the late Middle Ages might bear the coats of arms not just of the current lord, but of his ancestors, of the great families he was related to by marriage, of his liege lords and his royal allies. The whole genealogy of his power, expressed in carved shields. Anyone passing by could see at a glance who lived in the castle, where his family came from, who his important relations were, what claims he might be making to particular lands or titles. The gate, in other words, was an essay in heraldry, telling the story of the lord's standing in the world. And the people of the surrounding country, even if they could not read the Latin of a charter or the French of a court document, could very often read heraldry. Heraldry was a kind of universal language. The colours had meanings. The symbols had meanings. A boar on a shield, a lion, a fleur-de-lis, an eagle, a chevron, a band of stripes. All of these meant something specific to those who knew the codes. And it was not only the gentry who knew the codes. Ordinary people, who lived under particular lords and saw their banners every day, knew at least the local heraldry by sight. They knew the colours of their own lord, the badges of his important neighbours, the arms of the royal house. The shields on the gatehouse spoke to them in a language they understood. Banners and flags played the same role, but more dynamically. When the lord was in residence, his banner flew from the highest tower. When he was away, the banner came down, and the household ran on a reduced state, with no daily feasting and no formal court. The presence or absence of the banner was a daily piece of public information, telling the surrounding countryside whether the lord was at home or not. Visitors approaching the castle would look up first to see if the banner was flying. Local people, going about their daily business, knew without being told whether or not the great man was in residence. When important guests arrived, the banners of the guests would be flown alongside that of the host, as a courtesy and as a public announcement of the alliance. When the king or a great prince visited, his royal standard would fly above all the others, and the whole castle would deck itself out in additional banners and decorations to mark the occasion. The walls of the castle, on such occasions, would be hung with tapestries and rich cloths, on the outside as well as the inside, transforming the grey stones into a riot of colour. The whole building became, for a few days, a kind of festival pavilion. Now think about what this means for our understanding of what castles were. A purely defensive structure does not need to be decorated. A purely defensive structure does not benefit from being hung with cloth of gold. A purely defensive structure does not have its gatehouse covered with carved family arms. A purely defensive structure is, in its proper form, austere and functional, like a Roman fort or a modern military bunker. But medieval castles were not austere. They were ornamented, sometimes lavishly, in ways that had no military purpose at all, and that would actually have made defense slightly harder, by creating decorative elements that could be damaged or pulled down. The decoration was the point. The castle was meant to be looked at, and to be admired, and to be feared by people who could not read. The castle was a kind of book about the Lord, open to be read by the eye, written in stone and paint and cloth and metal. And the Lord, when he commissioned a new castle, or rebuilt an old one, was acutely aware of this. He spent his money not only on thick walls and strong gates, but also on stone carvers and painters and herald painters and gilders, who could make the buildings say the right things about him. He cared about how it looked from the road. He cared about how it looked from the river. He cared about the angle at which his coat of arms caught the light over the gate. He cared about whether the towers were proportioned in the right way, whether the gatehouse had enough of the right kind of decoration, whether the chapel windows were large enough to be seen from outside. The castle was, in this respect, a vanity project as much as a fortification, and the vanity was not a moral failing. The vanity was the actual purpose. The Lord was using his wealth and his taste to communicate, to a world without newspapers, what kind of man he was, and what kind of family he came from, and what kind of power he held. The castle was his personal monument while he lived, and his monument to his successors after he was gone. And here is one of the strangest things about the long story of castle building in Britain. As the centuries went on, and as the practical demands of warfare changed, the visual and symbolic side of the castle grew steadily more important, while the strictly defensive side grew steadily less important. By the late 14th century, when men like John of Gaunt were building places like Bolton Castle in Yorkshire, the buildings were almost entirely about display. Bolton Castle is a rectangular block of 4 corner towers around an internal courtyard. Its walls are impressive, but they are not really designed to withstand a serious siege by an army with proper siege engines. They are designed to look impressive, to dominate the surrounding landscape of Wensleydale, to provide a great household with a setting fit for its dignity. They are designed for show. By the 15th century, even this much pretense of defence began to fall away. Great houses, like Tattershall Castle in Lincolnshire, built by Ralph Cromwell, were essentially towers of brick designed to look like castles, but built to a standard that no serious soldier would have considered defensible by the standards of the time. The walls were too thin, the towers were too high and too elegant, the windows were too large. The whole building was in effect a luxurious country house dressed up in the costume of an earlier age, when castles had really been fortresses. Tattershall is sometimes called a tower house, sometimes called a great tower, and the language matters because the building does not quite fit any earlier category. It is not really a castle in the original sense, and not really a country house in the later sense. It is something in between, a pretend castle. A castle as fashion statement, and it is far from unique. All over 15th century England, lords were building things like this. Hurstmonceux in Sussex, a great brick castle of around 1440, looks like a fortress at first glance, but is really a country house with battlements stuck on top. Caister Castle in Norfolk, built by the famous soldier Sir John Fastolf with his earnings from the French wars, is another example. These buildings have the silhouette of castles but the soft heart of mansions. They are dressing up. They are saying, the man who lives here is the kind of man who could, in the right circumstances, be a great warrior, like his grandfathers. He is the kind of man who knows about castles, who comes from the castle-building class, who deserves to be respected on the terms of an earlier age. But the actual military requirements have changed by his time, and his castle is, in truth, a country house with a costume on. This is a very important transition. It tells us that the castle, by the 15th century, had become, even more openly than before, a symbol, a piece of inherited prestige, a way of claiming a place in a long aristocratic story, even if the actual conditions of war had moved on. The castle was no longer keeping anyone out. It was, more than ever, keeping a particular kind of lordship in. And we are now very close, in our story, to the moment when even that pretense would finally fall away. But before we follow that long decline, we have to be fair, and we have to acknowledge that castles were sometimes besieged in earnest. We have been arguing all evening that the primary purpose of the castle was not defence. We have not been arguing that defence was unimportant, only that it was secondary. And from time to time, in the long history of British castles, the secondary function became, suddenly and dramatically, the most important. From time to time, real armies turned up at real castle gates with real intentions of taking them. And what happened in those rare moments tells us a great deal about how castles actually worked. Let us think of one of the most famous of all medieval sieges in Britain, the Great Siege of Kenilworth in 1266. Kenilworth Castle sits in the green Warwickshire countryside, on a low rise that was, in the 13th century, surrounded on three sides by a great artificial lake. The lake had been created by damming the small Finham Brook, and the resulting expanse of water, called the Great Mere, ran for nearly 100 acres around the castle, isolating it from the surrounding land. This was, in itself, a remarkable piece of engineering, and it was a tribute to the wealth and ambition of the lord who had created it. By the time of the siege we are talking about, Kenilworth was held by the family of Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, who had been the leader of a great baronial rebellion against King Henry III. Simon himself had been killed at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, but his supporters had gathered at Kenilworth and were determined to hold out against the king. The king, by then, was advised by his eldest son, Edward, the future Edward I, the man who would later build the Iron Ring in Wales. Edward at this stage was a young, sharp, energetic prince, and he saw at once that Kenilworth would have to be taken. The siege began in the summer of 1266. The royal army surrounded the castle on the dry sides, and barges were dragged overland to the lake to give them some control of the water. The siege went on, in one form or another, for the better part of 6 months. The royal army deployed siege engines, including catapults and trebuchets, which threw stones and other missiles at the walls and into the courtyard. The defenders threw stones back, and according to one chronicler, the two sides became so adept at throwings that their missiles sometimes met in the air between the engines. The defenders refused offers of surrender. They suffered from disease and from shortage of food, but they held out. In the end, they were forced to surrender not by the breach of the walls, but by the failure of supplies and by the spread of sickness through their ranks. The walls themselves were never taken by assault. The castle stood up to everything the king's army could throw at it. The Kenilworth siege is famous for several reasons. It was the longest siege in English medieval history. It involved sophisticated siege machinery on both sides. It produced one of the great documents of medieval English politics, the Dictum of Kenilworth, by which the surrendering rebels were allowed to redeem their lands by payment of a fine, rather than being permanently disinherited. And it demonstrated quite vividly just how hard it could be to take a properly built castle in the 13th century. Even with a determined royal army, with skilled engineers, with weeks and months of time, the king's men could not break through the walls. They could only wait for the inside to fail. Now this seems to support the idea that castles were, after all, built for defence. They were certainly very good at it. But notice what the siege actually tells us. It tells us that taking a castle by force was so difficult, so expensive, and so time-consuming that almost no one in their right mind would attempt it without overwhelming reasons. Simon de Montfort's supporters at Kenilworth were holding out, in the end, not because they really believed they could defeat the king, but because they had nothing else to bargain with. They were using the castle as a final piece of leverage. Their resistance lasted 6 months because the castle was strong and because the king could not easily get at them. But for the rest of the country, in the rest of the medieval period, this kind of long siege was very, very rare. Most lords, most of the time, did not have access to siege engines on the scale needed to take a great stone castle. Most lords did not have the manpower to maintain a siege for 6 months. Most lords did not have the political backing to attempt such a thing, without consequences from the king or from their fellow nobles, and, most importantly, most disputes between lords did not actually rise to the level where a full siege was thought to be worth the trouble. Local quarrels were usually settled in other ways, by raids on each other's cattle, by burning each other's barns, by armed but limited skirmishes in the fields, by appeals to the king or to higher courts, by carefully arranged marriages and negotiated treaties. The full-scale siege of a major castle was the exception, not the rule. It happened only in the most extreme cases, when there was nothing else to do, and the very rarity of those occasions tells us something important about the castle. The castle was a deterrent. It worked by being so daunting that in most cases, no one tried to attack it at all. The cost of attacking was so high and the prospects of success so low that it made far more sense for an enemy to do something else. Raid the lord's outlying farms, attack his retainers on the road, petition the king against him, wait for him to die, and then move in on his heirs. The castle, simply by existing, channeled aggression into other forms. It made certain kinds of attack uneconomical, and in that sense, the castle was a kind of insurance policy against a worst-case scenario. You paid for it, in money and labour and stone. You hoped it would never have to be used in earnest, and in most cases, it never was. Now think of another famous siege, the Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. Rochester Castle is a great stone keep standing on a hill in the Kentish town of Rochester, beside the River Medway. It is one of the tallest medieval keeps in England, nearly 100 feet high, with thick walls of pale Kentish ragstone. In 1215, in the months following the granting of Magna Carta, the conflict between King John and his rebellious barons had broken into open war, and the rebel barons had taken Rochester Castle as one of their key strongholds on the road from London to the coast. John could not afford to leave Rochester in rebel hands. He marched south with his army and laid siege. The siege of Rochester lasted from October until the end of November, about 7 weeks. John's army used the usual siege techniques. Catapults bombarded the walls. The garrison was sealed off from outside supply, and the king himself ordered an unusual and brutal piece of medieval siege engineering. His miners dug a tunnel under one corner of the great square keep. The tunnel was propped up with wooden beams as it went. When the tunnel was ready, John's men brought in 40 pigs, slaughtered them, and used the pig fat to fuel a great fire in the tunnel. The fire burned the wooden props. The tunnel collapsed. And as the tunnel collapsed, the corner of the keep above it cracked and fell, opening a great breach in the southern angle of the building. The defenders retreated into the other part of the keep, behind a thick cross wall, and held out for another few weeks. But eventually, they too were forced to surrender, mostly by starvation, rather than by direct assault. The story of Rochester is famous for the gruesome detail of the pigs, but it tells us several other things that matter more. It tells us that even one of the strongest castles in England could, in the end, be brought down, if the besieger had enough time, enough manpower, enough resources, and enough determination. It tells us that the techniques for taking a stone castle did exist, even in the early 13th century, although they were laborious and expensive. It tells us that no castle, no matter how strong, was actually invulnerable. And it tells us that when a really determined enemy turned up with the right means and the right intent, the walls could be breached. The walls slowed an enemy down. The walls did not, in the end, make an enemy impossible. So the castle's defensive function was always something of a bluff, a very effective bluff, because the cost of calling it was very high, but a bluff nonetheless. The castle did not actually make the lord invulnerable. It just made him so expensive to attack that most enemies did not bother trying. And when a truly powerful enemy did decide to bother, the castle could fall. King John took Rochester. Simon de Montfort's men eventually gave up Kenilworth. The great Welsh castles of Edward, in the long term, kept Wales but did not prevent local risings from temporarily seizing some of them. In the wars of the late Middle Ages, in the Wars of the Roses and the long disturbances of the 15th century, castles changed hands repeatedly, often without dramatic sieges, simply because the political situation around them shifted and their constables changed sides. The castle was always, in this sense, a creature of the political world that surrounded it. It depended on the loyalty of its garrison, on the support of its lord's allies, on the willingness of the king to come and rescue it if necessary. Take away those things, and the walls themselves were not nearly as solid as they looked. But the political work the castle did, day after day, year after year, the work of holding a piece of country for a particular lord, the work of administering justice and collecting taxes and overawing the local population. That work went on regardless of whether the castle was ever besieged. That was the steady, undramatic, quietly successful function of the castle. And it is the reason that in the end we have to look at castles not as fortresses, but as small armoured capitals of small private states, scattered across the British landscape in their thousands. Let us now move north and let us cross the long line of hills and rivers that separates England from Scotland. We are going into a country with its own long and difficult history of castles. The Scottish story is not the same as the English story, but the underlying truths are the same. The castle in Scotland, like the castle in England and the castle in Wales, was less about defence and more about power. It just operated within a different political world. Scotland in the Middle Ages was a separate kingdom, with its own kings and its own laws and its own traditions. The Scottish kings claimed descent from the old Gaelic kings of Dalriada and from the Pictish kings of the north, and they ruled a country that was in many ways two countries combined. There was the Highland Zone, the great mountain country of the north and west, where the Gaelic language was spoken, where clans rather than feudal lords ran local affairs, and where the king's writ ran thinly, if at all. And there was the lowland zone, the rolling country of the south and east, where the language was a form of English, where feudal lords held land on terms broadly similar to those in England, and where the Scottish kings actually exercised practical government. Castles, in Scotland, were mostly a lowland phenomenon. The Highland country had its own kind of fortified houses, the smaller tower houses and brocks and duns that grew out of an older tradition. But the great stone castles of the medieval European style were concentrated in the lowlands, especially along the lines of the royal authority. And the two greatest of these castles, Edinburgh and Stirling, sit on natural rock formations of extraordinary defensive value, in places where the political geography of the country focused. Edinburgh Castle stands on a great volcanic rock that rises sheer above the surrounding city. The rock is hundreds of feet high, with cliffs on three sides, accessible only from one direction along a narrow ridge. The geological accident of the rock made Edinburgh almost inevitably the kind of place where a fortress would be built. The Iron Age people had a fort here, the early medieval kings had a stronghold here, and the medieval kings of Scots from the time of David I in the early 12th century developed the site as one of the great royal castles of their kingdom. From Edinburgh, the king could command the entrance to the Forth, the great inlet of the sea that almost cut Scotland in two, and could project his authority over the surrounding Lothians. Stirling Castle, a little to the west and north, stood on another great rock, smaller than Edinburgh's, but in some ways even more strategically placed. Stirling commanded the only easy crossing point of the River Forth above its tidal stretch. To get from the south of Scotland to the north of Scotland by land, you had to pass within sight of Stirling. The castle dominated that crossing. Whoever held Stirling controlled the road into the Highlands. Edinburgh was the seat of power. Stirling was the gateway, and both of them were, from the early medieval period onwards, central to any campaign for control of Scotland. This becomes critically important when we get to the period of the Scottish Wars of Independence, the long struggle in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, during which Edward I, the same king who had subdued Wales, attempted also to subdue Scotland. The story is well known in its outlines. After the death of the Scottish king Alexander III in 1286, and the death of his young heiress, the Maid of Norway, a few years later, the Scottish throne stood empty. There were several claimants, and Edward of England was invited to arbitrate. He used the invitation to assert overlordship over Scotland and to install a compliant king of his own choice, John Balliol. When Balliol turned out not to be compliant enough, Edward invaded, deposed him, and tried to rule Scotland directly. The Scots resisted. There were great risings, first under William Wallace and then under Robert the Bruce. There were great battles, the most famous being Stirling Bridge in 1297 and Bannockburn in 1314. And throughout this long struggle, the castles of Scotland passed back and forth between English and Scottish hands like counters on a board. Edinburgh fell to the Scots in 1314 in a daring night assault led by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, whose men climbed the sheer cliffs of the rock by night using ropes and rope ladders. The garrison was surprised, and the castle was taken. Stirling, in the same year, was the immediate cause of the great Battle of Bannockburn. The English garrison there had agreed to surrender by a certain date, if not relieved, and Edward II of England brought a great army north to relieve it. The Scots, under Robert the Bruce, met the English army on the boggy ground south of Stirling, and the resulting battle was one of the most famous victories in Scottish history. The English army was broken, the King of England fled south, and Stirling fell to the Scots a few days later. Now, here is the interesting thing for our purposes. After Bannockburn, what did the Scots do with the castles they had just won? Did they garrison them, repair them, prepare them to be the centres of a renewed Scottish administration? No, they did the opposite. Robert the Bruce ordered most of the great castles of Scotland, including Edinburgh and Stirling and many of the lesser royal castles, to be slighted. Slighting was the medieval term for deliberately damaging a castle, so that it could not be used as a fortress again. The walls were thrown down, the towers were broken open, the gates were pulled from their hinges. The defenders made the castles, on purpose, unusable. They did this because they understood, with great clarity, what castles were really for. They understood that a strong castle in Scotland was an asset for whoever held it. If the Scots held it, it strengthened their hand. But if the English came back and took it, it strengthened the English hand even more, because the English would use it, as before, as a base for controlling the surrounding country. The Scots calculated that they were more often going to be on the losing end of the next round of campaigning than on the winning end, and so a working castle was, in their view, more likely to be used against them than for them. Better to break the walls and force any future English invader to start from scratch. This decision tells us, more clearly than almost anything else in the medieval record, what castles were really for. They were not defences for the local people. They were tools of central administration. A castle in Scottish hands controlled Scotland for the Scots. A castle in English hands controlled Scotland for the English. The same castle, the same walls, the same towers. The function depended entirely on who was inside. The walls themselves were neutral. They held in whoever was the lord at the moment. And the people of the surrounding country, the farmers and the smiths and the wandering shepherds, lived under whichever lord happened to be sitting in the castle that year. The walls did not protect them. The walls determined who got to extract their wealth and their labour. The Bruce, in slighting his own castles, was acting on this understanding. He was saying, the castle is not Scotland, the castle is whoever sits in it, and if we cannot guarantee that we will always be the ones sitting in it, then better that no one sit in it. Better that the walls come down and the lordship be exercised without the help of these dangerous tools. There is a kind of grim wisdom in this. It admits, frankly, that the castle is a political instrument, not a defensive necessity. It admits that the castle could be used against the very people it was supposed to protect, and it acts on that admission. The Bruce did not slight every castle. Some he kept, because they were useful. Stirling, after a time, was rebuilt as a royal residence rather than as a serious military fortress, and so were others. But the principle was established. The Scots understood the castle differently from the English, perhaps because they had been on the receiving end of English castle building in their own country. They had seen what it meant when an English lord planted a great fortress in a Scottish glen. They had felt what it meant to walk past those walls with the English banner flying overhead. And when they got the chance to choose what to do with those walls, they often chose to pull them down. The contrast with what happened in Wales, where the English castles mostly remained standing, is striking. In Wales, the English crown was strong enough, in the long term, to keep its castles operating. The Welsh risings of the 14th and 15th centuries took some of the castles for a while, but the English authority always came back, and the castles were repaired and rearmed. In Scotland, the political balance was different. The Scots eventually drove out the English entirely, and the question of what to do with the castles became a question internal to Scottish politics, with the King of Scots having to decide which lords could be trusted with which strongholds. Castles in Scotland in the centuries after Bannockburn became, more openly than in England, the private property of great lords, each one a small kingdom of its own. The great Scottish nobility, like the Douglases in the Borders, or the Stuarts in the north, built and held castles that were, in effect, alternative centres of power to the royal court. The Scottish king was, for much of the late Middle Ages, less powerful than the greatest of his nobles, who controlled vast territories from their own fortresses and who could, when they chose, defy the crown. The castle in Scotland became, in this sense, even more clearly a private political instrument than the castle in England. The castle in Scotland was, often, a symbol of how weak the king was, rather than how strong he was. The great noble in his stone tower was not defending Scotland. He was in many cases holding Scotland in check, balancing the king, exercising a kind of sovereignty over his own corner of the country that no English baron would have dared to claim openly. And the castles of these Scottish nobles, places like Threave in Galloway, the Black Douglas stronghold, or like Down in Perthshire, or like Durlton in East Lothian, are some of the most impressive in the British Isles. Not because they were the strongest in a military sense, but because they were the most clearly statements of the power of the man who owned them. They were the courts of small kings within a larger kingdom, and the walls that surrounded them were not really defending anyone. They were defining a particular kind of authority. They were saying, here, on this hill, in this castle, a Douglas lives, or a Stuart, or a Lindsay, and the king in Edinburgh had better remember that. There is another part of the British Isles where the castle, as a tool of private power, can be seen even more clearly than in Scotland. We have to talk about the Welsh Marches, the long borderland between England and Wales, where for several hundred years a particular kind of lord ruled his own small country from his own great castle, almost entirely free from the interference of the king. The Welsh Marches, in the language of the time, simply meant the borders. The word marches comes from an old word, meaning a frontier or a boundary. The Welsh Marches were the broken country, mostly upland and forest and river valley, that ran roughly from the Severn estuary in the south, up along the line of the old kingdom of Mercia, to the Dee in the north. After the Norman conquest, this borderland was the most unsettled part of William's new kingdom. The Welsh princes in the high country to the west were still, as we have seen, more or less independent. The English crown could not easily project its authority into the broken hill country between the two, and so William and his successors made a particular arrangement with the Norman lords who were willing to take on this difficult and dangerous job. They gave these lords something that no other lords in the kingdom had. They gave them what amounted to royal powers within their own territories. The Marcher lord could make his own laws within his own lordship. As long as those laws did not directly contradict the king's, he could hold his own courts with the power of life and death over his tenants. He could mint coin, in some cases. He could raise his own private armies without needing the king's permission. He could make war on his neighbours, especially on his Welsh neighbours across the border, almost as if he were an independent prince. And he could do all of this from his own private castles, which were the visible centres of his very real authority. The list of these Marcher lordships is long, and the names of the castles are some of the most famous in British history. Chepstow Castle, perched on its cliff above the Lower Wye; Goodrich Castle, with its red sandstone walls; Ludlow Castle, the great fortress town on the Thames; Wigmore Castle, the home of the Mortimers; Brecon Castle; Caerphilly Castle, perhaps the largest castle in the British Isles after the Tower of London and Windsor; Cardiff Castle; Newport Castle; Pembroke Castle, the birthplace of Henry VII; White Castle; Skemfrith; Grosmont; Hay; Clifford; Bilth. The list could go on for some time. Each of these castles was the centre of a small lordship, sometimes quite small, sometimes covering a wide stretch of country. The lord lived in the castle, or in one of his castles, if he had several, and from there he ruled his lands more or less as a private prince. He had his own household officers, his own clerks, his own court, his own justice. He held lands by feudal tenure from the king, in theory, But the king's officers did not run his administration. He did. The royal sheriffs of Hereford and Shropshire and Gloucestershire could not enter the Marcher lordships to enforce English law. The king's courts at Westminster had only limited jurisdiction over Marcher matters. The Marcher lord was, in his own country, the law. Now, this arrangement existed for one reason. The crown needed lords on the border who could keep the Welsh in check, and it could not provide royal administration directly to such a difficult country. And so it bought the service of these lords by giving them effectively royal powers within their own lands. The castle was the physical guarantee of those powers. The castle was where the lord exercised his powers. The castle was where his court sat, his archives were kept, his soldiers lived, his tax collectors came home to. The castle, in a Marcher lordship, was the state. And here we see, perhaps even more clearly than in Wales itself, that the castle was not really a defensive structure. The Marcher lord was not, most of the time, sitting in his castle waiting to be attacked. He was sitting in his castle running his country. The castle was his capital, and the castle was also, when the lord chose to use it that way, the springboard from which he could raid his neighbours, both Welsh and English. The Marchers were notorious for their private wars. Marcher lords feuded with each other for generations, sometimes over inheritances, sometimes over rights to particular lands, sometimes over old wrongs that no one remembered. They burnt each other's villages. They drove off each other's cattle. They imprisoned each other's tenants. They fought each other, occasionally, in pitched battles between their household troops. And then they retreated, after each round of trouble, into their respective castles, where they could not easily be reached. The castle, in the Marcher world, was both the centre of administration and the safe house for private war. It was the rook on the chessboard, the piece from which the lord moved out to do his business, and to which he returned for safety. And it was no accident that the Marcher lordships, with their unusually free castles and their unusually unrestrained lords, produced some of the most beautiful and elaborate castles in the British Isles. Caerphilly, in particular, is worth looking at in this light. Caerphilly Castle, built by Gilbert de Clare in the second half of the 13th century, is one of the largest castles in Europe. It covers something like 30 acres of ground, with concentric rings of walls and towers and gatehouses, surrounded by extensive artificial lakes that defended the approaches on every side. It is bigger than the Tower of London. It is bigger than any of Edward I's Welsh castles, and it was built not by a king, but by a private lord, the Earl of Gloucester and Hereford, one of the great Marcher lords of his day. Why so big? Why so elaborate? Why such a vast investment in stone and earth and water? The defensive arguments do not really explain it. Caerphilly is sited in a valley, not on a hilltop, and the elaborate water defences, while impressive, would not have been impossible to overcome with sufficient determination. The most likely answer is that Caerphilly was, more than anything else, a statement. The Earl of Gloucester was saying, "Here is what I am. I am the kind of lord who can build a castle this big. I am the equal, in many ways, of the king himself. My power in my own lands is as great as his power in his lands, and the surrounding country, both Welsh and English, can never forget that." The castle was, in this sense, a piece of political display on the grandest scale. It was a peacock's tail in stone. It was a demonstration of capability rather than a piece of practical infrastructure. And it makes very little sense when you think about it, except as the assertion of a particular kind of personal lordship. There is a similar story in Ireland, where the Normans came in the late 12th century at the invitation of an Irish king and stayed, as they always did, because they liked the country. The Norman lords of Ireland built castles all over the eastern half of the country, places like Trim and Carrickfergus and Roscrea and Killaloe, planting themselves in the Irish green countryside as a kind of armoured aristocracy living above the Gaelic population. These castles were, in some ways, even more clearly tools of conquest than the castles in Wales or in Scotland. They were placed in a country whose native population had a very different way of life, a different language, a different system of law, a different social order. The Irish, for the most part, lived in small ring forts and earthwork enclosures rather than in stone fortresses. They did not build castles in the Norman style. When the Normans came and started planting stone keeps in the countryside, the visual contrast was extreme. The castle stood out in the Irish landscape like a foreign thing, a sudden alien geometry imposed on the soft curves of the green country. And it functioned in much the same way as the Norman castles had functioned in England 2 generations earlier, as an instrument of occupation. The Norman lord in his Irish castle lived above the surrounding population in every sense. He was richer, he had different food, he spoke a different language at his own table, his wife and his children wore different clothes. His clerks wrote in Latin and Norman French rather than in Gaelic. He was, in effect, a colonist with stone walls around him, and the castle was the physical guarantee that he could continue to be a colonist, generation after generation. The Irish, like the Welsh and like the Scots in their own ways, did sometimes rise against the Norman colonization, and there were periods when the Norman hold on Ireland weakened and the Gaelic Irish recovered control of large parts of the country. There were even periods when individual Norman families became, in effect, more Irish than the Irish themselves, intermarrying with the local population, adopting Gaelic customs, speaking the Gaelic language. But the castles, where they were built solidly enough, often remained in some form, even as the politics changed around them. Trim Castle, on the River Boyne in County Meath, is still one of the largest medieval castles in Ireland today, standing as a great square keep with a polygonal floor plan, surrounded by curtain walls and a moat. Carrickfergus, on the coast of Antrim, still stands above the harbour, its keep rising above the small town that grew up beside it. These castles were built to dominate. They are still, in a quieter way, dominating the landscape today, even though the world that created them has long since vanished. We have spent a lot of time looking at the cold, hard political reality of castles, the instrument of conquest, the seat of administration, the peacock's tail of lordly display. We should now spend a little time looking at the warmer side of the castle, the imaginative and cultural side, because the castle was also the home of a whole world of poetry and ritual and play. And this side of the story matters too, because it shows how the castle, beyond being a piece of stone, became a piece of culture. It became an idea that shaped how the medieval upper classes thought about themselves. From the 12th century onwards, a new kind of literature began to flow through the courts of Europe, including the courts of the British Isles. We call it, in a slightly old-fashioned phrase, the literature of courtly love and chivalry. It is the literature of the long romance, the verse epic about knights and ladies, about quests and tournaments, about love affairs and forbidden passions, and the strange tangle of honour and desire that bound the medieval aristocracy together. The stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table are the most famous examples of this literature, and they spread through England and Wales and across into France and Germany and Italy, becoming the common cultural property of all the Western aristocracy. Castles were central to these stories. The hero of a courtly romance does not ride out into ordinary villages or towns. He rides out into a landscape of castles. There is a castle on every horizon. The damsel in distress is in a castle. The wicked enchanter holds his prisoners in a castle. The good king holds his court in a castle. The hero, on his way to his quest, comes upon a castle in the forest and is given hospitality there for the night. Every important encounter, every important reversal of fortune, every important love affair takes place in or around a castle. The whole imagined world of the courtly romance is a world made of castles, and this matters because it shaped how the actual aristocracy thought about their own actual castles. The lord in his real stone keep was, in his own imagination, also the hero of his own romance. The lady in her actual chamber was also, in her own imagination, the lady of the romance, the object of song and verse and quest. The squires and knights who served the lord were, in their own imagination, the companions of King Arthur, the heroes of the long stories. The castle, in other words, was not just a building, it was a kind of stage for a story that the people who lived in it told themselves, and they decorated the castle accordingly. Tapestries on the walls showed scenes from the romances. Paintings on the chamber walls showed knights and ladies in idolized forests. The Lord's coat of arms was sometimes designed to refer to a particular romance hero with whom the family claimed connection. The names given to particular parts of the castle, like the Queen's Tower, or the Lion's Gate, or the Hall of Honor, often borrowed from the romances. The whole texture of imaginative life in a great household was steeped in stories about castles, and this was reinforced by actual events, which were themselves staged so that they would feel like scenes from a romance. The tournament was the great example of this. The medieval tournament was a kind of mock battle, fought between mounted knights with blunted lances and swords, in which great wealth and reputation could be won and lost. Tournaments were not held in castles exactly, but they were usually held within sight of one. A field would be marked out beside a castle, with viewing stands for the great ladies and the noble spectators. The knights would arrive, escorted by their squires, with their banners and their painted shields, and they would take part in jousts and melees that lasted for days. The castle in the background was part of the scenery. It was where the feasts happened in the evening. It was where the wounded were taken to be patched up. It was where the prizes were given. It was where the rituals before and after the tournament took place. The castle was the home base, the dressing room, the headquarters of the great chivalric performance. And the people, watching from the viewing stands, the ladies in their fine clothes, the men in their padded silks, were looking out across a landscape that brought together two things: the green field of the tournament and the grey wall of the castle in a single image. Chivalry and lordship, war as play and war as power, the two halves of medieval aristocratic life. The connection between the castle and the tournament was not always a happy one for the kings. Tournaments were dangerous things, not only because knights occasionally died in them, but because they brought together large groups of armed nobles in one place, and could provide cover for political plotting. Several English kings, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, tried to suppress tournaments or to confine them to certain places under royal supervision. The fear was that the great nobles, gathering for sport, might also gather for rebellion. The castle, in this light, was the place where the political danger of armed aristocrats could most easily be focused. And so the kings tried to keep tournaments away from particular castles, or to require that the lord, whose castle stood by the tournament field, had royal permission to host such an event. The whole arrangement was again deeply political. The chivalric play of the tournament was real play, and the lord and lady really enjoyed it, but it was play that had teeth, and the castle gave the play its setting. Now think about the everyday leisure life of a great lord, beyond the special days of the tournament. What did he do, mostly, when he was not running his administration or attending the king's court? He hunted. Hunting was the great passion and the great occupation of the medieval upper classes, and it shaped the landscape around the castle as profoundly as the castle itself shaped the political life of the surrounding country. Around every important castle, in the Middle Ages, there was a hunting park. The park was a defined piece of land, usually woodland or rough country, that had been enclosed with a fence or a bank and ditch and was stocked with deer for the lord's hunting. The park was a deliberate creation. It did not exist by accident. The lord had to choose the land, mark out its boundaries, build the pale around it, and stock it with game. He had to maintain it. He had to employ parkers, gamekeepers, woodsmen. He had to enforce the deer laws, which forbade unauthorized hunting under heavy penalties. He had to protect his deer from poachers and from wolves and from the local people, who might, given the chance, take a fat hind home for the winter. The park was a piece of carefully managed wilderness, kept apart from the surrounding farmland, reserved for the lord's pleasure, and it was almost always within easy riding distance of the castle, so that the lord could take his hounds and his huntsmen out in the morning and be back at the castle by evening. The park was, in a sense, the back garden of the castle, scaled up to several hundred or even several thousand acres. The hunt itself was a long, elaborate, ritualized activity. There were different kinds of hunting for different kinds of game. There was hunting with hounds for the red deer or the fallow deer, in which packs of dogs were used to drive the game towards the hunters, who killed it with bows or spears. There was the par force hunt, in which a single deer was chased over a long distance until it was exhausted and could be killed. There was hawking, in which trained falcons or hawks or eagles were carried on the wrist and flown at smaller birds. There was hunting with crossbows for boar, which was a dangerous and exciting sport because boars were known to charge the hunters and could injure or kill them. All of these had their seasons, their rules, their special vocabulary, their dedicated personnel. The hunt was a whole cultural institution, with its own books, its own training methods, its own etiquette. And the hunt was, in many ways, an extension of war by other means. The skills needed for hunting, the riding and the use of weapons, and the reading of the land and the management of men and animals were the same skills needed for war. The young knight was trained in both at the same time, and the hunt provided the daily exercise of these skills, keeping the lord and his household in fighting condition without actually having to go to war. The park, in this sense, was a kind of military training ground. The castle was the headquarters. The two together formed a complete system for the maintenance of a warrior aristocracy. And there was something more. The hunt was also a form of display. When the lord rode out with his huntsmen and his hounds, in his fine riding clothes, with his hawk on his wrist or his bow at his side, he was making himself visible to the surrounding country. The people working in the fields looked up and saw him pass. The peasants saw the small army of mounted men in their bright clothes moving along the edge of the wood. They knew their lord by sight, by the colours he wore, by the dogs that ran with him. The hunt was, like everything else about the castle, partly a performance. It demonstrated the lord's wealth, his health, his vigour, his lordship. It demonstrated the difference between him and the people in the fields. He could afford to spend his time chasing deer. They had to spend their time growing food. He had hawks, and they had no hawks. He had dogs of pure breed, and they had no dogs of any breed, or only the rough ones that kept the rats from the barn. The hunt was, in this sense, the daily reaffirmation of the social hierarchy that the castle anchored. And the castle, sitting at the centre of the hunting landscape, was both the home from which the hunt set out and the symbol of the social order that made the hunt possible. We should pause now and think for a while about the women who lived in castles. The popular image of the medieval castle is overwhelmingly a male image. Knights riding out, lords sitting in judgment, soldiers on the battlements, bishops blessing the army before it leaves on campaign. But the castle, like any working community, was full of women too, and the lives of those women were as much shaped by the castle as the lives of the men. And the women, in their own way, did as much to make the castle what it was as the men did. The most important woman in any castle was, of course, the lady, the wife of the lord. And as we mentioned earlier, the lady was not a passive figure. She ran the castle when the lord was away. She managed the household. She supervised the female servants. She received guests in her own right and could be expected to speak with authority on behalf of the family in her husband's absence. In some cases, when the lord died and his heir was a child, the lady ruled the castle and the estates on her own, sometimes for years, sometimes with considerable skill. The English and Welsh and Scottish histories are full of formidable widows who held castles for their sons or their grandsons, who defended their lands in court and in council, who arranged marriages and alliances, who managed armies of retainers, who sometimes even led their household troops in battle when there was no one else to do it. The most famous example, perhaps, is Nicolas de la Haye, who held Lincoln Castle for King John during the Great War between the king and the barons in 1217. Nicola was the hereditary constable of Lincoln Castle, an office she had inherited from her father, and she had been the wife of one of the king's loyal nobles. When the rebel barons besieged Lincoln in the spring of 1217, Nicola, who was by then a widow and well into her 60s, refused to surrender. She held the castle, with her small garrison, against the rebel army for week after week. The rebels could not break in. They surrounded the castle, they bombarded it, they cut off its supplies, but Nicola would not yield. And in the end, the royal army under the regent William Marshall arrived and broke through to relieve her. The relief of Lincoln and the battle that followed was one of the decisive events of the war and helped to save the throne for the young Henry III. Nicola de la Haye, in her 60s, in her stone keep, with her elderly garrison, had held one of the most important castles in England against a serious siege by a determined enemy. She was not, in any sense, a passive figure in a tower. She was the lord of the castle, in fact, if not in title. And her story is not unique. There were many other ladies who held castles in their own right, especially during the long civil wars of the 12th century, known as the Anarchy, when King Stephen and the Empress Matilda fought for the English crown. Matilda herself was at one point trapped in Oxford Castle by Stephen's army, and famously escaped over the frozen Thames in a long white cloak on a snowy night, lowering herself by ropes from one of the towers and walking across the ice to safety. The escape from Oxford is one of the most cinematic moments in medieval English history, and it is the story of a great lady acting decisively in a desperate military situation. The castle, for these women, was both their prison and their fortress, both their home and their headquarters, and the castle as a building was in many small and large ways shaped by their presence. The private chambers, the solars and bowers, were as much the ladies' spaces as the lords'. The chapel, where daily mass was said, was often particularly associated with the lady, who in many households was the most regular and devout attender. The garden, where one existed, was often the lady's particular concern, with herbs grown for the kitchen and for medicine, and flowers grown for pleasure. The nursery, where the lord's children were raised in their early years, was a female space, run by the lady or by a nurse acting in her name. The lord's children grew up surrounded mostly by women, before being sent away, in the case of the boys, to be brought up in other noble households as pages and squires. The castle, in this sense, was the cradle as well as the courthouse. And it was the cradle of a particular kind of upbringing. The lord's daughter learned, from her earliest years, how to be the lady of a castle of her own. She learned to read and write, often, although less commonly than her brothers, and she learned the rituals of the household, the prayers, the courtesies, the music, the embroidery, the management of servants. She learned what it would mean to marry into another noble family and to become, in time, the lady of someone else's castle. The marriages of noble daughters were one of the most important political instruments in the medieval world. A daughter married into the right family could bring lands and alliances and prospects to her own family. A daughter married badly could waste the family's chances for a generation, and so the great lords spent a great deal of time and energy arranging the marriages of their daughters, often when the daughters were still children, sometimes when they were still babies, with the actual wedding to take place years later when they were old enough. The daughters did not, in most cases, get a great deal of choice about whom they married. The marriage was an act of high state policy, made by the lord in consultation with his advisers, and the daughter was, in practical terms, an instrument of that policy. She left her father's castle, often very young, often barely knowing her future husband at all, and she took up residence in his castle, where she would have to learn a new household, new servants, new traditions, new in-laws, sometimes new languages and customs. She might never see her parents again, or only on rare occasions when the great families gathered for some royal event. The lady of a castle, in this sense, was very often a kind of exile, brought to her husband's lands as a child or as a very young woman, and never fully at home in the country she now inhabited. And yet, very often, these displaced young women rose to become the rulers of the households they had entered as strangers. They learned the country. They became loved by their servants. They became the managers of estates that they had never seen before in their lives, and they did the work well. They wrote letters in fine educated hands to other ladies in other castles, and the letters they wrote in the 15th century, the so-called Paston letters and others, give us one of our best windows into what daily life in these households was actually like. From these letters, we can hear, across the centuries, the real voices of women managing real castles in real political turmoil. We can hear them worrying about their sons in the wars. We can hear them sending instructions to their stewards. We can hear them planning their menus for visits from important guests. We can hear them complaining about the weather. We can hear them, in short, being completely human, completely intelligent, completely engaged with the difficult business of running a great household in a violent and uncertain age. And we can see that the castle was not really, despite the popular image, a man's world with a few women in it. It was a place where men and women worked side by side, where the lady held real power, where the upbringing of children was shared, where the rituals of daily life were as much female as male. The castle was a household first and a fortress second, and the household, like every household, was made by women as much as by men. There are even cases, surprisingly common when you look for them, where the castle was held by a woman in her own right, without any male overlord, because she had inherited it directly from her father, with no surviving brothers. The English law on female inheritance was complex, but it allowed, in certain circumstances, for great heiresses to hold lands and castles directly. Such heiresses were among the most sought-after marriage prospects in the kingdom. The young woman with castles to bring to her husband could make a great match, and until she married, or sometimes after her husband died, she might run her castles and her estates herself. The Scottish history is particularly rich in examples of formidable widow lords. Women like Black Agnes of Dunbar, who held Dunbar Castle in 1338 against a great English siege. The story of Black Agnes is a wonderful one, and it captures the spirit of medieval female lordship at its boldest. When the English army arrived at Dunbar and demanded the surrender of the castle, Agnes is said to have leaned over the battlements and called down insults at them. When the English used a great catapult to hurl stones at the walls, Agnes is said to have walked along the battlements with a maid behind her, calmly wiping the dust off the stones with a fine linen cloth, as if to say, "Your missiles are mere dirt to us." And when the siege failed, after 5 months, the English withdrew, having gained nothing. Whether the stories of Agnes wiping the stones with linen are quite literally true, they capture something about how she was remembered, and about the kind of woman who could, in the right circumstances, become the symbol of the entire castle. The castle was not always, as the popular image would have us think, a male preserve. The castle was often, surprisingly, a place where female courage and female intelligence and female lordship found their fullest expression. All things, in time, come to an end. The world that created the medieval castle did not last forever, and the castle as a working institution did not last forever either. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a series of changes overtook England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland, and these changes gradually made the castle, in its old sense, obsolete. By the end of the 17th century, no one was building real castles in the British Isles anymore. The great age of the castle was over, although its long afterlife as a romantic monument was just beginning. The most famous reason for the decline of the castle is gunpowder. The story we have all been taught is that gunpowder weapons, when they reached the British Isles in the late 14th century, made castles obsolete. Cannon could batter down the thick stone walls of the medieval keep in ways that medieval siege engines could not. The high, straight walls of the castle were vulnerable to cannon fire, because cannonballs could chip away at them at long range, where archers from the battlements could not respond. The stories of the late medieval and early modern sieges include some dramatic examples of cannon doing exactly this. Harlech Castle in Wales fell to a sustained cannon bombardment in 1468. Other castles in the Wars of the Roses period changed hands after similar artillery sieges. By the time of the English Civil War in the 17th century, cannon were the standard tool for taking castles, and very few castles could hold out for long once the besiegers had set up their guns. There is certainly truth in this story, but it is not the whole truth, and in some ways it can mislead us. Cannon did not destroy the castle overnight. The transition from arrow to cannonball, in terms of siege warfare, was actually quite slow, and it was not until the 16th century that artillery became really decisive in most sieges. And even when cannon were available, the castle could be adapted, to some extent, to deal with them. Some castles were rebuilt with thicker, lower, more angled walls that could absorb cannon fire better. Some castles were fitted with gun loops, openings designed for handheld firearms, alongside the older arrow loops. In Scotland, a particular kind of small fortified house developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, the so-called Z-plan tower house, which was specifically designed to give defenders sweeping fields of fire with handguns covering all approaches. So castles did not simply collapse before gunpowder, they evolved for a while, and the lords who built them tried to keep them relevant, in narrowly military terms, for as long as they could. But there was a deeper change going on, one that had less to do with gunpowder and more to do with politics. The medieval castle had made sense in a world where private lords had to be, in effect, small kings within their own lands. The castle was the necessary headquarters of a lord who had to administer his own justice, collect his own taxes, raise his own troops, and defend his own territory against neighbours and rivals. But by the late 15th and 16th centuries, the political world was changing. The English crown, especially under the Tudors, was working hard to centralise authority. The king was building up a national administration, with royal courts in London, royal officers in every county, royal authority running directly to every parish. The great private lordships of the Middle Ages, the kind of lordship that needed a castle to function, were being slowly absorbed into a single national system. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, came to the throne in 1485 after the long disorder of the Wars of the Roses, and he and his son, Henry VIII, set about reducing the independent power of the great nobles. They restricted the keeping of private armies, the so-called retinues and liveries, by which great lords had maintained their own household troops. They centralized the courts of justice, so that more and more cases came up to royal courts at Westminster, rather than being decided in the local courts of great barons. They abolished, at least in theory, many of the special privileges of the marcher lordships in Wales, through the Acts of Union of 1536 and 1543, bringing Wales fully under English administration. They dissolved the monasteries, taking much of the church's wealth into the crown, and they redistributed monastic lands to a new class of gentry families who held them on terms that bound them closely to the crown, rather than to any feudal hierarchy of their own. In 100 years, give or take, the political world that had made castles necessary as private headquarters of private power was being dismantled. The great lord no longer needed a castle, because he no longer needed to be a small king. He could be, instead, a courtier of the great king, a member of parliament, a county official, a regional notable, all without needing to fortify his own house against either the king or his neighbours. The walls had become, in this new world, beside the point. And so what the great families of England and Wales and Scotland started to build in the 16th and 17th centuries was not castles, but great houses. The Tudor and Jacobean Great House is one of the most important architectural inventions of the period. It is a large and impressive country dwelling, often built on the foundations or with the materials of a former castle, but designed not to be defended. The Great House has large windows, often very large windows, sometimes covering most of the wall, because in this new world it is more important to let in the light than to keep out the arrows. The Great House has wide doors and inviting approaches, often with formal gardens laid out around it, because the Great House is meant to welcome guests rather than to repel them. The Great House has chimneys and fireplaces in every room, because comfort matters more than fortification. The Great House has long galleries and elaborate staircases and elegant ceilings, because the Great House is, in the deepest sense, a place of social display rather than military defence. Houses like Longleat in Wiltshire, built in the 1560s by Sir John Thynne, or Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, built in the 1590s by Elizabeth Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury, or Burghley House in Lincolnshire, built by William Cecil, the great minister of Queen Elizabeth, are masterpieces of a new architectural language. They are unfortified. They are open. They are designed around the spectacle of fine living rather than the necessity of survival. And yet, if you look at them carefully, you can see that they retain a few echoes of the castle. They are tall. They have towers at the corners. Sometimes. They have battlements, sometimes, of a purely decorative kind. They have a certain monumentality that calls back to the castles of an earlier age. They are, in their own way, still trying to look impressive in the way castles had been impressive, even though they have abandoned every actual defensive feature that castles had. They are, you might say, castles in disguise. They are the buildings of a class that still wanted to be thought of as descended from the castle-building aristocracy, even though that class had transformed itself, through 100 years of Tudor politics, into a different kind of governing elite. The castle as a building type was over, but the castle as a cultural memory was still alive. And the lords of the New Age still wanted, in some part of themselves, to live in something that gestured at the castles of their ancestors. There is a fascinating moment in the late 16th and early 17th centuries when this nostalgia became almost playful. A few great houses were built in deliberately old-fashioned styles, with mock battlements and mock towers and mock keep-like masses in a kind of conscious archaism. Bolsover Castle in Derbyshire, built in the early 17th century by Sir Charles Cavendish and finished by his son William, is one of the most striking examples. It looks, from a distance, like a medieval castle, with its great square keep and its high curtain wall, but it was never intended to be defended. The interiors are full of elegant chambers and elaborate fireplaces and luxurious painted ceilings. The whole building is a kind of architectural fantasy on the theme of the castle, designed to give the lord the romance of medieval lordship without the bother of medieval warfare. Bolsover is, in this sense, the first sham castle in English history. It is a country house pretending to be a castle, and it tells us a great deal about where the castle, as an idea, was heading. The castle was becoming a fancy dress costume. The wealthy family that wanted to feel ancient and noble could put their house in the costume of a castle, just as a man might put on the dress of his grandfather for a special occasion. The castle, once an instrument of real power, was becoming an instrument of decorative pretense, and the pretense would only grow stronger as the centuries went on. By the time of the 18th century, the building of sham castles, follies, and pretend medieval ruins on great estates would become a positive fashion. Gentlemen with too much money and not enough to do would build entire artificial castles on their lands, sometimes hiring hermits to live in them and pretend to be solitary monks, all to give a particular aesthetic effect to the gardens. The castle, by then, would have left the world of politics entirely and entered the world of landscape gardening. But before we get to those 18th century follies, we have to deal with one more great drama of the working castle, one last violent chapter in which many of the surviving medieval castles of the British Isles met their final fate. We have to deal with the English Civil War and with the great wave of destruction that swept through the castles of the kingdom in the 1640s. The English Civil War, which broke out in 1642 between King Charles I and his Parliament, was the last great age of castle warfare in the British Isles. For nearly a decade, between 1642 and 1651, the country was torn apart by a series of overlapping conflicts in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, in which the medieval castles of the kingdom played their final military role. Many of them were besieged, many of them changed hands. Many of them, in the end, were deliberately destroyed. And the reason for this final wave of destruction tells us, perhaps more clearly than anything else in the story, what castles were really for and why their time had come. When the war began, the king and the parliament both moved quickly to secure as many of the kingdom's strong places as they could. The royalists held some castles, the parliamentarians held others, and across the country there were small garrisons of soldiers, sometimes only a few dozen men, sitting in old medieval castles and trying to hold them for one side or the other. These were not full national armies. The Civil War, especially in its early years, was fought on a relatively small scale, with thousands rather than tens of thousands of soldiers in each major engagement, and with local garrisons playing a much bigger role than they would in a modern war. The castles, although they were by now several hundred years out of date in terms of military architecture, still mattered because there were not very many large modern fortresses in England, and the old castles were what was available. So a great many small sieges happened during the Civil War. At Wardour Castle in Wiltshire, Lady Blanche Arundel held the castle for the king against a parliamentary army in 1643, with only 25 men, plus her women and servants. Lady Blanche, in her 60s, organised the defence personally, distributing weapons and food and ammunition, and held the castle for several days against a force of more than 1,000 soldiers before being forced to surrender on terms. She is sometimes compared, justifiably, to Nicola de la Haye and Black Agnes, the female castle holders of the medieval period. The tradition of formidable widows running their castles in crisis ran straight through the centuries. At Basing House in Hampshire, the Marquis of Winchester held out against a long parliamentary siege for years, with the royalist defenders writing the words, "Loyalty above all," on the walls in defiance. When Basing House finally fell to Oliver Cromwell himself in 1645, the building was destroyed completely, and the Marquis and his garrison were taken away as prisoners. At Pembroke Castle in Wales, the great 12th century stronghold of the Earls of Pembroke held out against a parliamentary siege for weeks before surrendering. At Corfe Castle in Dorset, Lady Mary Banks held the castle for the king for 3 years, defending it twice against parliamentary attack, until it was finally taken by treachery in 1646. The story of Corfe is particularly poignant because Lady Mary was, like Lady Blanche Arundel, a woman of remarkable courage, and the castle was finally lost, not by force of arms, but because one of her own officers betrayed her by letting the besiegers in through a side gate. Across the country, similar dramas were playing out. Castles were being held, attacked, surrendered, recaptured. Their walls, although designed for a different kind of war, were still surprisingly effective against the artillery of the 17th century, especially when the artillery was small and the besiegers were few. Plenty of castles held out for surprisingly long periods. Some never fell at all, or were given up only by negotiation rather than by assault. The walls did their work, even in this final crisis. But here is where the story turns, and turns dramatically. After Parliament won the war, and after the king was executed in 1649, the new government had to decide what to do with the castles. They had just spent 10 years and a great deal of blood and treasure capturing them. Many of these castles had been used repeatedly as royalist strongholds during the conflict. If left standing, they could be used again in any future rebellion against the new Republican regime. The decision was not in doubt when looked at this way. The government, in a series of orders during the late 1640s and the early 1650s, ordered the slighting of dozens of castles across England and Wales. Slighting, as we have seen, was the deliberate destruction of fortifications so that they could not be used again. In the Civil War period, slighting was carried out systematically and on a large scale. The walls of castles were undermined and blown up with gunpowder. The towers were thrown down. The gatehouses were broken. The keeps were partly demolished. And many of the most famous medieval castles of England received, in those years, the wounds that they still carry today. Corfe Castle was slighted in 1646. The Great Keep was undermined and partly collapsed. The walls were broken open. The gatehouse was destroyed. What you see at Corfe today, the dramatic ruin standing on its high green hill in Dorset, is the result of that deliberate destruction. The castle was not eroded by the weather. It was, quite literally, blown up. Kenilworth Castle, the great fortress of the de Montforts, and later of John of Gaunt, was slighted in 1649. The dam of the Great Mere was broken. The lake drained away, and parts of the curtain wall and the keep were destroyed. What survives today is an impressive ruin, but it is a ruin that was made in a single deliberate act, not by centuries of decay. Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, one of the strongest castles in the north of England, was slighted so completely after the Civil War that today almost nothing remains except its earthworks. The walls and towers were levelled to the ground. The site was, for centuries afterwards, used as a market garden. Sandal Castle, Sheriff Hutton, Helmsley, Belvoir, Raby, Cawood, all of them were damaged or destroyed in this period. So were Welsh castles like Aberystwyth, Montgomery, Raglan, and many others. The same pattern repeated everywhere. The castle was taken by the parliamentary army, the garrison was sent away, and then the walls were blown up. And the question to ask is why? Why such systematic destruction? Why not simply leave the castles standing as ruins, unmanned, harmless? Why blow them up? The answer, again, is that the castles were not, in the strict sense, defensive structures. They were political structures. As long as they stood intact, they could be turned by a new political faction into bases for resistance. A standing castle, even an empty one, was a piece of political capital that could be picked up and used by whoever happened to occupy it next. Parliament wanted no such capital lying around. They wanted, in effect, to prevent any future rebellion from finding ready-made fortresses scattered across the country. And so they destroyed the castles, deliberately, to prevent that. They were not destroying military targets, they were destroying political possibilities. They were saying, this old way of doing politics, with great private fortresses scattered across the kingdom, is over. From now on, the only authority will be the central government in London. There will be no more local strongholds. There will be no more places of refuge for losing factions. There will be no more castle holding by ambitious lords. The castles must come down. And, in large part, they did. The Civil War slighting was the single most dramatic event in the physical history of British castles. More medieval castles were damaged or destroyed in those few years than in any comparable period before or since. The face of the British landscape, in terms of standing medieval fortifications, was changed forever. Before the Civil War, much of the medieval castle inheritance was still in use, with families living in many of these places, sometimes in the original buildings, sometimes in newer houses built within the old walls. After the Civil War, many of those castles were ruins. The families moved out, sometimes to nearby manor houses or new mansions, and the old walls were left to the weather. And it is this final wave of destruction that gave the British landscape the look that it has today. The romantic ruin, the empty keep on the green hill, the broken gatehouse with ivy growing out of it, the smashed wall with the sky showing through where the chamber used to be. All of this, the look that we now associate with the medieval castle in Britain, is partly the result of 17th century politics. The castle was not allowed to die a natural death. The castle was killed off, deliberately, by men who understood, perhaps better than we do, what castles really were. They were not nostalgic about the medieval past. They were not interested in preserving the architectural heritage. They saw the castles as what they had been, instruments of an older kind of politics, and they brought that older kind of politics to a definitive end. The slighting of the castles was the physical sign of a political change that had been coming for 2 centuries. The era of the great private lord, holding his own piece of the country from his own stone fortress, was over. The era of the centralized national state had begun, and the castles, broken and silent on their hills, were the gravestones of the old world. Now we come to the strangest chapter of all in the long story of British castles. Because after the slighting of the 17th century, after the destruction of so many of the working medieval castles, you might expect that the castle as a building type would simply have vanished. The lords who had once needed them no longer needed them. The political world that had made them necessary no longer existed. The walls had been blown up. The keeps had been pulled down. The case for the castle, in any practical sense, was finally closed. And yet, just a generation or two after the last of the medieval castles had been deliberately destroyed, the British began to build castles again. Not real castles this time, not as instruments of administration or war, but pretend castles, sham castles, castles built purely as objects of fancy and beauty and romantic feeling. The 18th century, in many ways the most rational and orderly age in British cultural history, with its science and its philosophy and its careful Georgian architecture, was also the age in which the dream of the medieval castle came back to life in a new form, and the new castles were stranger, in some ways, than the old ones had been. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the change in cultural taste that swept across Western Europe in the 18th century. The early part of the century was dominated by what we now call the Augustan or classical mood. It was a mood that admired ancient Rome, ancient Greece, clean proportions, balanced facades, white columns, marble floors. The great houses of the early 18th century, places like Houghton Hall in Norfolk or Holcombe Hall in the same county, were built in this classical style, with porticos and pediments and statues of Roman gods in the niches. The medieval period, with its rough stones and its irregular silhouettes and its dark stories of barons and bishops, was thought of as crude, primitive, embarrassing. Educated people did not want to be reminded of it. The medieval ruins on the British landscape, including the slighted castles, were seen, in the early 18th century, mostly as inconvenient lumps of old stone, useful perhaps as a source of building material for newer projects, but not as objects to be admired in their own right. But this began to change. By the middle of the 18th century, a new taste was emerging, and this new taste actively preferred the irregular, the ruined, the picturesque, the Gothic. It found beauty in the very things that the classical taste had despised. Old ruins, especially castles and abbeys, became fashionable subjects for painters and poets. The landscape, with a broken keep on a hill, with ivy climbing up the walls and birds nesting in the empty towers, became one of the favourite scenes for picturesque artists. Watercolourists like Paul Samby and J.M.W. Turner travelled around the country making sketches and paintings of medieval ruins, presenting them as objects of melancholy and wonder. Poets like Thomas Gray and James Macpherson wrote verses in which old castles and lost kingdoms played a starring role. The popular imagination, which had hardly noticed the castles for a couple of generations, suddenly rediscovered them, and rediscovered them as something beautiful and important. And then a few wealthy enthusiasts started to build new castles of their own in the spirit of this rediscovery. The most famous early example is Strawberry Hill House, the country home of the writer and politician Horace Walpole, which he began building in the 1750s at Twickenham, on the banks of the Thames just west of London. Strawberry Hill is not, technically, a castle. It is a fairly modest-sized villa, originally a small farmhouse that Walpole bought and gradually transformed into a fanciful Gothic confection. He added battlements, pointed windows, Gothic tracery, dark-panelled chambers, a long gallery designed to look like a medieval cloister, and a tower with views over the river. The whole building is full of Gothic detail, much of it copied or adapted from actual medieval sources that Walpole had studied during his travels. He spent decades on it, and he wrote a famous letter describing his pleasure in creating, on a small scale, a kind of personal fantasy of medieval life. And he wrote, in this same house, one of the first true Gothic novels, called The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764. The Castle of Otranto is the great founding text of Gothic fiction, and it is set, of course, in a medieval castle. The castle in the novel is haunted, full of secret passages and hidden chambers, with a great helmet that falls from the sky and crushes the rightful heir, and a long story of inheritance and ghosts and forbidden love. The novel was a sensation. It started a whole genre of Gothic fiction that would eventually include works by Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis, and, much later, by Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker. And almost all of these Gothic novels were set in castles. The castle, in the popular imagination of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, became the location of dark mystery, hidden crime, romantic passion, supernatural terror. The actual medieval castle, with its tax records and its kitchen staff and its courts of justice, was completely lost in this new vision. The castle, in Gothic fiction, was a place of mystery rather than of administration. It was a place of ghosts rather than of lordship. It was, in short, exactly the opposite of what real castles had been when they were inhabited, and the fictional castle began to influence what people actually built. Through the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, wealthy landowners across Britain commissioned new houses in the Gothic and castellated styles. These houses were not castles in the original sense. They were ordinary country houses with Gothic and medieval decoration applied to them. They had battlemented parapets, but the battlements were purely decorative. They had towers, but the towers were drawing rooms or staircase wells. They had Gothic arches over the doors, but the doors led into elegant Georgian rooms with classical proportions inside. The medieval costume was wrapped around a thoroughly modern house. The most famous of these creations is probably Fonthill Abbey, built by the eccentric and immensely wealthy William Beckford between 1796 and 1812. Fonthill was not really an abbey, but a sham Gothic mansion in Wiltshire, with a vast central tower nearly 300 feet high. The tower was built too quickly by inexperienced builders and on inadequate foundations, and within a few years it began to show signs of collapse. Beckford eventually sold the house, and not long after the new owner moved in, the great tower came crashing down in 1825. Fonthill was a folly in every sense, both in its conception as an architectural fantasy and in its eventual failure as an engineering project. But before it fell down, it was the talk of fashionable Britain. People came from miles around to gawk at the great Gothic mansion rising in the Wiltshire countryside. They saw it as a kind of architectural poem, a building that expressed the romantic mood of the age, and they wanted, many of them, to have something like it for themselves. So sham castles and Gothic mansions began to spring up all over the British countryside. Eastnor Castle in Herefordshire, built between 1812 and 1820. Penrhyn Castle in North Wales, built between 1822 and 1840 by Thomas Hopper for the slate magnate George Hay Dawkins Pennant, with the wealth from his Caribbean sugar plantations and his Welsh slate quarries. Belvoir Castle in Leicestershire, the seat of the Dukes of Rutland, was extensively rebuilt in the early 19th century in a romantic medieval style. Arundel Castle in Sussex was given a similar treatment, and in Scotland, the Scottish baronial style emerged in the early 19th century, building country houses in the form of tall, narrow towers with corbelled turrets and crow-stepped gables, all in a kind of romantic version of the late medieval Scottish tower house tradition. The grandest example of the Scottish baronial style is Balmoral Castle, the Highland residence built by Prince Albert for Queen Victoria in the 1850s, set in the deer forests of the Dee Valley in Aberdeenshire. Balmoral is not, of course, a real castle in the medieval sense. It is a Victorian country house with a tower and battlements, designed to feel like the kind of Scottish home that a particular kind of romanticised Scottish nobleman might have lived in. But it has become, over the generations, one of the most famous castles in Britain, the holiday home of the British royal family, the place where prime ministers visit the monarch each summer. It has become, in a sense, the real thing, even though it began as a piece of architectural play. And the same is true of many of the other Gothic castles of the 19th century. They have, by long use, become real. They are real homes now, or real hotels, or real museums. They are part of the landscape. We do not, when we look at them, easily distinguish between the medieval castles that were built for political reasons and these 19th century inventions that were built for romantic reasons. They blur together in our minds. The lord of a real medieval castle and the wealthy Victorian industrialist who built a fake castle to look like one, both of them disappear, in the end, into the single category of the castle dweller. And the buildings themselves, the genuine medieval keep and the Victorian baronial mansion, become, in the popular mind, the same kind of thing. This blurring of the real and the fake became, in the late 19th century, even more thorough because the Victorians began to restore the old medieval castles that had survived in ruin. And the restoration was often, in its own way, as much an act of imagination as the building of a brand new sham castle. Throughout the Victorian period, wealthy owners of old castles, sometimes inheriting them and sometimes buying them, set about repairing and rebuilding parts of the ruins. They added new roofs to old keeps. They restored battlements that had crumbled away. They rebuilt towers that had fallen. They cleared the ivy from the walls. They opened up rooms that had been blocked off and made them habitable again. And they often, in this process, made the castles look more medieval than they had ever actually been. The restoration of Cardiff Castle by William Burgess for the 3rd Marquess of Bute in the 1870s and 1880s is one of the most remarkable examples of this. Cardiff Castle had a real medieval core, with a Norman keep and parts of the medieval curtain wall still standing, but the Marquess and Burgess added to it a whole new range of Victorian Gothic apartments, with elaborate painted rooms, gilded ceilings, banks of stained glass, and decorative themes drawn from medieval romance, biblical history, and Oriental art. The result is one of the most extraordinary buildings in Britain, half real medieval castle, half Victorian fantasy, with the two so intertwined that it is hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. The same thing happened at many other castles. Windsor Castle, which had been the official residence of the English monarchs since the time of William the Conqueror, was extensively rebuilt and restored in the early 19th century by the architect Geoffrey Wyatville for King George IV, who added battlements and towers and Gothic windows to make the castle look more medieval and more romantic than it really was. The Windsor we see today, with its long line of dramatic battlements above the Thames Valley, owes much of its present silhouette to George IV's 19th century renovations. The medieval bones are still in there, but they are dressed in 19th century costume. And by the late Victorian period, this restoration impulse was becoming a national obsession. The middle classes, having read their Walter Scott novels and their Tennyson poems about King Arthur, were enthusiastic visitors of castles. The new railways made it possible, for the first time, for ordinary families to travel into the countryside on day trips to see picturesque ruins. Guidebooks were published, with engravings of the most famous castles and descriptions of their histories. Picture postcards of castles became a popular souvenir, and the castles, by this time, mostly the property of the great noble families, or increasingly, of public bodies like the National Trust or local councils, began to be presented to the public as historical attractions. The story being told to the public, however, was not the story we have been telling tonight. The story being told to the public was the romantic story. The story of brave knights defending the walls against invaders. The story of damsels at the windows. The story of kings and queens holding court in the great halls. The story of sieges and battles and chivalry. The political story, the story of conquest and administration and tax collection and intimidation of conquered populations, was hardly mentioned. The castles had been turned, by the late Victorian period, into stage sets for a particular national myth. And that myth of medieval Britain as a land of romance and chivalry served a particular purpose in the British Empire of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The empire had become, by that time, the greatest empire in the world, with vast possessions in India, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia, in North America. The British liked to think of themselves as having a particular gift for empire, a particular wisdom in ruling other peoples, a particular tradition of honourable warfare and noble government. And the medieval castle, in the popular mind, was made to support this story. The castle showed, the story went, that the British had always been a strong, noble, martial people, descended from castle-building knights and chivalrous lords, with a long tradition of honourable governance. It was a comforting story, and it helped to give the imperial enterprise a certain dignity in the eyes of those who carried it out. The fact that the original medieval castles had themselves been instruments of an earlier kind of empire, the Norman Empire in Britain, was conveniently forgotten. The fact that they had been used to subjugate the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish was glossed over. The fact that they had been built, in many cases, by foreign elites holding down conquered native populations was not part of the story. The castles, in the imperial period, were presented as expressions of a glorious British national tradition. And from this Victorian and Edwardian presentation, much of what people today think they know about castles is descended. The modern castle, the castle in our films and our holiday brochures and our children's books, is the castle of the late Victorian imagination. It is the castle of Camelot, the castle of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe, the castle of brave knights and beautiful princesses. It is the castle as a permanent national symbol of British identity, a kind of architectural flag that the British have wrapped around themselves to declare who they are and what they stand for. And then, in the 20th century, the castle escaped Britain altogether and became a global cultural symbol. The American entertainment industry, especially in the films of Walt Disney, took the British and European castle and turned it into the most recognizable symbol of children's fantasy in the modern world. The famous Disney castle, with its high white tower and its blue pointed roof, which appears at the beginning of every Disney film, is loosely based on a real European castle, Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, which was itself a piece of Victorian Romantic invention built by the Bavarian king Ludwig II in the 1880s as a kind of fairy tale fantasy. The Disney castle, in turn, has become the image that hundreds of millions of children around the world now associate with the word castle. When a child today imagines a castle, they imagine the Disney castle, not the real medieval keep with its dark passages and its kitchens and its tax records. The castle has become, in this final transformation, a piece of pure imagination, almost entirely detached from any historical reality. And this is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about castles, viewed across the long span of their history. They began as instruments of political domination. They became, in time, the homes and offices and stages of a particular kind of aristocratic life. They were, in the 17th century, deliberately destroyed as the political world that had made them necessary came to an end. And then, in their afterlife, they were rebuilt and reimagined and turned into symbols of romance, then into symbols of national identity, then into symbols of universal childhood fantasy. The castle has lived a much longer life as an idea than it ever lived as a building. The actual working castles, with their lords and their tax collectors and their household priests, lasted in their full original form for perhaps 400 years, from the time of the Norman conquest to the early 16th century. The castle as a romantic image has lasted for at least 300 years, from the early 18th century to the present day, with no sign of slowing down. The castle as a piece of imagination is, by now, a more durable thing than the castle as a piece of stone. And it travels everywhere. It travels into children's films. It travels into theme parks. It travels into the great wedding venues that British castles have become, where couples from all over the world come to be married in the grand setting of a real or pretended medieval keep. The castle as a wedding venue is, in its own quiet way, the final triumph of the romantic story over the political story. The bride and groom, standing in the great hall, dressed in modern finery, photographed against the old stone walls, are participating in a piece of theatre that owes nothing to the actual lordly politics of the Middle Ages and everything to the Gothic novel and the Victorian historical romance. They are using the castle as a stage for their own personal story, just as the medieval lord used the same castle as a stage for his own political story. The stage has lasted, the play has changed, and the castle has been, throughout, an extraordinarily generous stage, willing to host any story that anyone wanted to tell on it. The castle as instrument of conquest. The castle as administrative office. The castle as romantic ruin. The castle as wedding venue. The castle as theme park castle. All of these are real, and all of them are using the same essential building in different ways. The castle, in this sense, is one of the most adaptable cultural objects ever invented in these islands. It has refused to die, even after the political world that created it died several centuries ago. It has, instead, kept finding new uses for itself, new stories to inhabit, new meanings to take on. And it shows no sign of stopping. In our own time, the castle has settled into a new and rather different role, which is the role of cultural heritage. In Britain today, the great majority of surviving castles are managed by one of a small number of large organisations whose business is the care and presentation of historic buildings. In England, the largest of these are the National Trust and English Heritage. In Scotland, the equivalent bodies are the National Trust for Scotland and Historic Environment Scotland. In Wales, the work is done by the National Trust and by KDW, the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service. In Northern Ireland, it is the National Trust and the Historic Environment Division. Between them, these organisations own or manage hundreds of castles, ruins, fortified houses, and tower houses across the British Isles. They maintain the masonry, they control access, they build visitor centres, they print guidebooks, they train guides, they organise events, they run gift shops and cafes, they employ thousands of people, and they earn their keep, largely, by selling tickets to the public. The modern castle in this incarnation, is an economic asset. It is a generator of tourism revenue, a magnet for visitors, a contributor to the local economies of the towns and villages around it. A castle like Warwick or like Edinburgh can attract more than 1 million visitors a year. The income from those visitors supports not only the upkeep of the castle, but also a whole ecosystem of nearby businesses. Hotels, restaurants, taxi firms, bus companies, souvenir shops all benefit from the presence of a major castle nearby. Castles, in this sense, have become an important industry. The lords who built them would have understood in their own way that castles were always economic assets, that they were always centers of revenue and administration and trade. They might be surprised to learn that the revenue now flows in the form of pound coins from tourists, rather than in the form of taxes from peasants, but they would recognize the underlying logic. The castle has always been a way of extracting wealth from the surrounding landscape. In our time, the wealth comes from people who travel willingly to see it, rather than from people who were compelled to pay for it. But the basic economic function has, in a strange way, persisted. The presentation of castles to the modern visitor has, over the past few decades, become more thoughtful and more honest than it used to be. The Victorian and Edwardian story of romance and chivalry, which dominated the public understanding of castles for so long, has gradually been supplemented and corrected by a more historically accurate account. Modern guidebooks are far more likely than their predecessors to mention the practical realities of castle life. They talk about the sanitation, about the food, about the lives of the servants, about the position of women, about the role of children, about the relationship between the castle and the surrounding peasantry. They talk about the political function of the castle as much as about its military function. They acknowledge that the castle was, in many places, an instrument of conquest as much as a symbol of national pride. The visitors who come to castles today are increasingly being told a more truthful version of the story than was being told 100 years ago. This is partly because the academic study of castles over the past half-century has been transformed. The new generation of castle scholars sees the castle as a complex cultural object, not just as a piece of military hardware. And this scholarly shift has gradually filtered down into the public presentations at the castle sites themselves. A visitor today to a castle like Bodiam, in Sussex, is likely to be told that Bodiam, despite its dramatic appearance with its symmetrical towers and its perfect rectangular moat, was probably never a serious military fortress. Bodiam was built in the 1380s by Sir Edward Dalingrigg, a knight who had made his fortune in the French wars. It looks, from the outside, like a textbook medieval castle, with broad towers and crenellated walls reflected in still water. But its walls are too thin to withstand a serious siege, its windows are too large for genuine defense, and the moat around it has been shown by modern study to be a designed ornamental feature, deliberately created to show the castle off to its best advantage from particular viewpoints. Bodiam was, in other words, a kind of medieval theme park castle, built to look impressive and to impress the neighbours, but not really designed to fight a war. The same thing has been argued about other late medieval castles, like Cooling in Kent and Wrestle in Yorkshire and Sheriff Hutton in Yorkshire. They were status symbols dressed up in military costume, rather than serious military buildings. This more sophisticated understanding of castles has been spreading slowly into the public consciousness, partly through the better quality of modern interpretation at the sites themselves, and partly through the work of popular historians and television documentary makers who have brought academic insights to a wider audience. The British public, on the whole, knows more about the real history of castles today than it did a generation ago. But the romantic story, of course, has not disappeared. The romantic story is too well established, too deeply rooted in the national imagination, to be displaced by a more accurate version. The two versions coexist. The visitor who walks around a castle today is likely to encounter both stories at once. The guidebook will give them the more accurate political and social history. The film they saw last week, or the children's book they read to their child the night before, will have given them the romantic version. The two stories sit side by side in the visitor's mind, and most people are not particularly bothered by the contradiction. The romantic story is what makes the castle exciting to visit. The accurate story is what makes the castle interesting to think about afterwards. The castles themselves, the actual stones and walls and rooms, are quite willing to support both stories. They are remarkably patient buildings. They have hosted so many different stories over the centuries that one more is no trouble to them. The castle has also, in our time, taken on a new life as a film location. The film and television industry, particularly in Britain, but also internationally, has discovered that real medieval castles are wonderful backdrops for historical drama and fantasy. The popularity of films and television series set in the Middle Ages or in imaginary medieval worlds has made castles more recognizable than ever. Productions like the various film adaptations of Robin Hood, like the British television series set in medieval England, like the international fantasy series that borrow heavily from medieval imagery, have used castles like Alnwick, Bamburgh, Warwick, Down, Caerphilly, Pembroke, Bodiam, and many others as their settings. The fees paid by film companies to use these castles as locations are an important source of revenue for the owners and managers. And the appearance of a castle in a famous film or television series often boosts visitor numbers afterwards, as people travel to see, in real life, the place they have seen on screen. The Scottish Castle of Down, which we mentioned earlier as one of the castles built by the Stuart family in the late 14th century, has become a particular favourite of filmmakers. It was used as a location for the Monty Python film about King Arthur in the 1970s, and more recently, it has been used in various other historical and fantasy productions. Doune Castle now sells more tickets, perhaps because of its film associations than because of its medieval history. This new association of castles with film and television has had an interesting effect on how the public imagines castles. People today, when they think of a medieval castle, are likely to picture it, not from a book or a painting, but from a film. And the film versions of castles, which combine real castle locations with set design and computer-generated effects, are gradually shaping the public imagination in new ways. The castle in popular imagination in the 21st century is becoming a kind of cinematic castle, somewhere between the real medieval keep and the entirely fictional fantasy castle, partaking of both worlds, comfortable in neither. And yet, despite all of these modern transformations, the real medieval castles are still there. They still stand on their hilltops and beside their rivers and on their crags above their towns. They still have the same essential shape that they had when they were built 800 or 900 years ago. The walls of Conwy, when you walk along them, are the walls that Edward I masons built in the 1280s. The keep of the Tower of London, when you enter it, is the keep that William the Conqueror's masons built in the 1070s. The great gatehouse of Caerphilly, when you stand under it, is the gatehouse that Gilbert de Clare's masons built in the 1270s. Across nearly 1,000 years, the stones themselves have endured. The political world that built them has long since vanished. The lords who commanded them are dust in their tombs. The peasants who worked the surrounding fields are dust in their fields. The kings who confiscated and redistributed them are figures in history books. But the stones themselves, the masonry that the medieval builders raised up out of the British landscape, is still there, still doing the work of standing up against the rain and the wind and the slow accumulation of human time. And in that endurance, there is something quite remarkable to consider as you drift slowly towards sleep. These walls were built by hands and tools that no longer exist, for purposes that no longer matter, by people who would not recognize the world that now surrounds their work. And yet, they remain. They remain, in part, because they were built so well. The medieval mason knew his trade. He knew how to lay a stone so that it would still be in place 1,000 years later. He knew how to choose his materials and how to bind them with lime mortar and how to angle his walls so that they would shed water and resist frost and bear the weight of the courses above them. He was working without modern engineering, without modern machinery, without modern science. But he was working with a craft tradition that went back, in some forms, to the Romans and even further back. The medieval English and Welsh and Scottish masons inherited a Mediterranean tradition of building in cut stone. which had been brought to these islands by the Romans and revived in the early Middle Ages by ecclesiastical builders and then taken up after the Norman conquest by the builders of castles. The skill of the medieval castle mason was the inheritance of centuries of craft knowledge. And when we stand inside a castle today and look up at the vaulted ceiling or along the line of a wall, we are looking at the visible record of that craft tradition. The stone itself remembers. The stone itself bears witness. The stone itself is the most patient of all historians, recording, in its very arrangement, the lives and skills and intentions of the people who put it there. There is one further category of British castle that deserves our attention before we begin to draw the threads of this long story together, and that is the small number of castles which are still, in the literal sense, inhabited. Most British castles, as we have seen, have passed out of private hands and into the care of public bodies, where they function as historical attractions and as ruins. But a handful of castles, scattered across these islands, are still owned by aristocratic families who actually live in them. These are the working castles of modern Britain. They are very few in number, but they tell us something quite specific about the long history we have been discussing, because they are the castles in which the original function of the castle as the residence of a great lord has, against all odds, survived into the modern world. The most famous of these, of course, is Windsor Castle. Windsor Castle is the official residence of the British monarch, and has been the official residence of the English and then British monarchs since the time of William the Conqueror, who built the original Motte and Bailey Castle there in the 1070s on a chalk ridge above the River Thames, a day's ride from London. Windsor was rebuilt in stone over the following centuries, was extended by successive monarchs, was the setting for tournaments and royal weddings and state ceremonies and political crises. It was the place where King Edward III founded the Order of the Garter in the 1340s. The Order of Chivalry, which still survives today as the senior order of British knighthood. It was extensively rebuilt by King Edward III himself in the 1360s to provide a fitting setting for the order. It was rebuilt again under King Charles II after the Restoration. With French-inspired interiors, it was rebuilt yet again, as we mentioned, under King George IV in the early 19th century, in the Romantic Gothic style. It survived a great fire in 1992, which destroyed many of its principal staterooms, and was painstakingly restored over the following 5 years. Through all of these changes, Windsor has remained an actual working royal residence. The reigning monarch still uses it. State visits are still hosted there. State banquets are held in the Great Hall. Royal weddings still take place in St. George's Chapel, which is the chapel of the Order of the Garter, with its magnificent late medieval vaulted ceiling and its quiet stalls bearing the heraldic plates of the knights. Members of the royal family are still buried there. The traditions and ceremonies that surround Windsor Castle are themselves the inheritance of nearly 1,000 years of continuous use. When the current monarch goes for a walk in the grounds of Windsor, they are walking on land that has been royal land since William the Conqueror's day. The castle has hardly ever, in its long history, ceased to be a working royal building. It is the most remarkable example in Britain, and perhaps in Europe, of a medieval castle that has remained in continuous use as the residence of its original sort of owner. Windsor is, in this sense, almost unique, but there are a small number of other castles which, though less famous and less continuously used, have also remained in private aristocratic hands and are still lived in by their owners. Arundel Castle in Sussex is one. Arundel has been the principal seat of the Dukes of Norfolk, the premier dukes of England, for many centuries. The Fitzalan and then the Howard families, who have held the Dukedom of Norfolk since the late 15th century, have lived at Arundel as their main country residence. The castle itself has medieval bones, going back to the 11th century, but has been heavily rebuilt and restored, particularly in the 19th century, to provide a comfortable modern country house dressed in medieval clothing. The Howards still live there. The present Duke of Norfolk is the head of one of the oldest aristocratic families in England, and the castle is the centre of his country estates and his ceremonial duties. The Duke of Norfolk holds the hereditary office of Earl Marshal of England, which makes him responsible for organising state ceremonies like coronations and royal funerals. The office is run from Arundel. The castle, in that sense, is still functioning as the administrative centre of a major aristocratic family, in much the way that medieval castles functioned as the administrative centres of medieval lordships. The forms have been modernised. The substance has, to a surprising degree, persisted. Alnwick Castle in Northumberland is another. Alnwick has been the seat of the Percy family, the Dukes of Northumberland, for many centuries. The Percys are one of the great northern families of England, descended from a Norman lord called William de Percy, who came over with the Conqueror in 1066, and they have held lands in Northumberland since the early Middle Ages. Alnwick Castle, which they have owned since the early 14th century, is one of the largest inhabited castles in Britain. Its great walls and towers rise out of the countryside near the small town of Alnwick, and the present Duke of Northumberland still lives there with his family, in a part of the castle, while other parts are open to the public during the tourist season. The Percys, like the Howards, have managed the unusual feat of preserving their hereditary estate across many centuries of social and political change. They have done it partly through canny marriages, partly through prudent management, partly through the occasional willingness to adapt to changing political circumstances, and partly through good luck. Alnwick Castle, like Windsor, has featured in many films, most notably in the early Harry Potter films, in which it stood in for parts of Hogwarts. The castle, therefore, receives a steady stream of fans of those films, in addition to ordinary historical visitors, and the income from tourism helps to support the costs of maintaining such a vast medieval building. Belvoir Castle in Leicestershire, which we mentioned earlier as one of the castles slighted after the Civil War, was rebuilt in the early 19th century and is still the home of the Dukes of Rutland, the head of the Manners family. The current castle is not really a medieval building at all, but a romantic Gothic country house built in the 19th century on the site of the older castle. But the family has lived there, in some form, on the same hilltop, for centuries, and they are still there. The castle is open to the public for part of the year, but the family continues to use it as their home. Inveraray Castle, in Argyll, on the west coast of Scotland, is the seat of the Dukes of Argyll, the chiefs of Clan Campbell. The present castle, like Belvoir, is not really a medieval building, but an 18th century Gothic country house, designed in part by Robert Milne and built in the 1740s on the site of older Campbell residences. But it stands in a long tradition of Campbell lordship, going back to the medieval period when the Campbells emerged as one of the most powerful clans in the Western Highlands. The current Duke and his family still live at Inveraray. The castle is open to visitors during the summer months. The Argyll family, like the Norfolks and the Northumberlands and the Rutlands, have managed to keep their ancestral seat going across the centuries. There are a few other inhabited castles scattered around the country. Glamis Castle in Angus is still the family home of the Earls of Strathmore and Kinghorn, the family from which the late Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, came. Glamis was the place where she grew up. The present castle is mostly 17th century, with romantic Gothic additions, but it stands on a site that has been associated with the Leon family since the late 14th century. Powys Castle in Welshpool is owned by the National Trust, but the Herbert family, the Earls of Powys, still have an interest in it and used to live there. Drumlanrig Castle in Dumfriesshire is the seat of the Dukes of Buccleuch and Queensberry, a beautiful pink sandstone 17th century building on the site of older castles. Flaws Castle in Roxburghshire is the seat of the Dukes of Roxburgh. Hever Castle in Kent, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, was rebuilt by the Astor family in the early 20th century and is still in private hands. There are perhaps a dozen or two such still inhabited castles in various states of repair and various stages of family fortune. They are the residue of the medieval aristocratic order, the last working remnant of the political system that the castles were originally built to serve. And they are remarkable, when you think about it, for the simple fact of their survival. The world that they belong to has been gone for centuries. The political power that justified their existence has been redistributed many times over. The economic basis of the great estates has been transformed by industrialization, by the growth of cities, by the rise of new forms of wealth in finance and commerce and manufacturing. The aristocracy itself has been politically marginalized, deprived of most of its old governmental roles, taxed heavily on its inheritances. The great country houses of England, of which the castles are only a subset, have been demolished by the hundreds in the 20th century. Whole estates have been broken up and sold off. Families that had held the same land for 30 generations have lost everything. And yet, a handful of castle-owning families, by some combination of skill and luck and inherited resilience, have continued to live in the castles that their ancestors built or acquired centuries ago. They are, in their own peculiar way, the living link to the medieval past. When you visit one of these still inhabited castles, the experience is rather different from visiting a castle that is purely a museum. There is, in the inhabited castle, a slight sense of intrusion. You are walking through someone's home, even if they are not in the room with you, even if they live mostly in private apartments and only allow visitors into the staterooms. The portraits on the walls are pictures of their ancestors. The furniture is the furniture they grew up with. The dogs you might pass on the lawn outside are their dogs. The flag flying from the highest tower indicates that the family is in residence. The whole atmosphere of the place is different from the atmosphere of a ruin or a museum, because the castle is still doing, in attenuated form, what it was originally built to do. It is still the residence of a great family. It is still the center of an estate. It is still, in some small way, performing the ancient function of providing the local landscape with a focus, a recognizable center, a place where the Lord lives. The visitor who walks through such a castle is, in a strange way, walking through a small surviving fragment of the medieval world. The fragment is dressed in modern clothes. The fragment has been heavily restored and rearranged. The fragment is hedged about with 21st century compromises and adaptations. But the fragment is still there, still alive, still functioning, and it gives the visitor, for a moment, a glimpse of what the medieval castle was actually like when it was working. It was a place where people lived. It was a place where decisions were made. It was a place where the local landscape was managed. It was a place where guests were received and entertained. It was a place where children grew up and where old people died. It was a place where life happened, day after day, year after year, across the long span of the family's tenure. And so, having walked the long path of this story together, from the wooden motters of the 11th century Normans, through the stone keeps of the early Plantagenets, through the great concentric fortresses of Edward I in Wales, through the courtyard houses of the late Middle Ages, through the slighted ruins of the Civil War, through the romantic restorations of the Georgians and Victorians, all the way to the inhabited castles and the heritage attractions and the film locations of our own time, we come at last to the question with which we began, and to the answer that the long history of British castles seems quite clearly to give. The question was whether castles were really built for defence. The answer, on the evidence of the actual history, is that defence was only ever one part, and often a quite small part, of what castles were really for. The castle was, from the very beginning, an instrument of political domination. The castle was the means by which a particular kind of lordly elite, first the Normans and then their descendants, imposed themselves on a conquered landscape, organized the collection of revenue from that landscape, exercised judicial authority over the people who lived in it, intimidated potential opponents into compliance, and provided themselves with a residence appropriate to their political position. The castle was an office building, a courthouse, a treasury, a prison, a meeting hall, a dining hall, a guest house, a chapel, a stable, a kitchen, a brewery, and a small fortress, all at the same time, all wrapped up in the same complex of walls and towers. Its military strength was important, but only as one part of its overall function. It existed to make the political position of its owner visible and unmistakable in the surrounding landscape. It existed to say, in stone, this is who is in charge here. The Welsh castles of Edward I said this to the conquered Welsh. The Anglo-Norman castles of the 11th and 12th centuries said this to the conquered English. The Marcher castles said this to the people of the borderlands. The northern castles said this to the Scots. The Irish castles said this to the Irish. Even in places where conquest was not the issue, the castle still functioned as a statement of lordship, a visible argument that the lord who owned the castle was a person of consequence whose authority was to be respected. The castle never stopped making this argument. From the 11th century to the 17th century, in every part of these islands, the castle was the architectural form in which lordly power expressed itself. And then, when the political world that had created the castle came to an end, the castle did not simply disappear. It transformed itself. It became, by stages, a romantic ruin, then a national symbol, then a tourist attraction, then a wedding venue, then a film location, then a global symbol of children's fantasy. It found new meanings to inhabit, new stories to support, new uses to perform. The castle as a piece of stone has remained remarkably stable across nearly 1,000 years. The castle, as a piece of meaning, has been astonishingly mobile, willing to mean almost anything that anyone wanted it to mean. And in this combination, the stability of the stone and the mobility of the meaning, lies much of the castle's enduring power. The castle has been able to outlive the political world that created it precisely because it has been so generous about what it would mean. It has been willing to be a symbol of conquest and a symbol of romance, a symbol of cruelty and a symbol of chivalry, a symbol of foreign domination and a symbol of native pride, sometimes all at the same time, sometimes in succession, sometimes in different mouths and at different times. The castle has been a Rorschach test for the British imagination, taking on the shape of whatever each generation has needed to see in it. And perhaps this generosity of meaning is, in the end, the most honest thing we can say about castles. They were not simply one thing. They were never simply one thing. They were always a complex collection of functions and meanings, woven together by the people who built them and used them and lived in them. The defense function was real. The political function was real. The administrative function was real. The residential function was real. The display function was real. The ceremonial function was real. The symbolic function was real. All of them were real at once, in different proportions, in different castles, and in different periods. And when we strip away the romance, when we look at the castle as it actually was, what we find is not a simple thing, but a tangled and many-sided thing, a building doing several different kinds of work at the same time, in much the same way that the great houses of later centuries did several different kinds of work at the same time, and in much the same way that any large important building in any society does several different kinds of work at the same time. The medieval castle was, in this sense, not really very different from any other major civic or governmental or aristocratic building in any period. It was a building of multiple uses, dressed in the architectural language of its time. The defensive language happened to be the dominant architectural language of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, because that was the period in which armed force was the main expression of political authority. When the architectural language of authority changed in the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, the buildings of authority changed too. The castle was replaced, gradually, by the country house, the palace, the town hall, the parliament building. The function of providing a visible centre of authority remained. The form in which that function was expressed evolved. The castle, in this long view, is just the medieval form of a permanent human need, the need to give political authority a physical presence in the landscape. That need has continued in every period, in every society. The forms have changed, the need has not. And so the next time you see a castle, in person, or in a film, or in a photograph, perhaps you will see it slightly differently. Perhaps you will see not only the romantic image of the great fortress on its hill, but also the office building behind the romance, the residence behind the romance, the administrative centre behind the romance, the political statement behind the romance. Perhaps you will see the castle as a building of work, of government, of revenue and judgment, as well as a building of legend. Perhaps you will see the men and women who built it, the masons and carpenters and labourers, the lords and ladies and servants, the clerks and chaplains and stable boys, all the people whose lives were lived in the shadow of its walls or within them. Perhaps you will see the castle as a piece of a particular world, a world we have inherited from but no longer inhabit, a world that was harder and sharper and stranger than the romantic picture we have of it, a world that nevertheless deserves to be understood on its own terms. And perhaps, having understood the castle a little better, you will also feel a certain affection for it. Because the castles, for all the bloody political work they did in their day, are also by now simply old buildings standing in the British landscape, weathered by centuries of rain, softened by centuries of lichen, made beautiful by the same forces of time that have made beautiful so much else in these islands. They are part of the look of the place. They are part of the look of Britain. They sit on their hills and beside their rivers and at the edges of their towns, and they shape the view of the country in which we live or which we visit. And in their quietness, in their stillness, in their patient endurance of weather and time, they have something to offer us beyond their history. They offer us a sense of continuity. They offer us a sense of how much time has passed. They offer us the consolation of looking at something very old and very durable, in a world that often feels far too new and far too fragile. And now, as we come to the end of this long telling, let your thoughts drift slowly away from castles and from history and from the long story of these islands. Let your breathing become slow and even. Let your body settle deeper into the place where you are resting. The walls of the castles will still be there in the morning. The story will still be there in the morning. There is nothing more to do tonight. There is nowhere to be. There is no problem to solve. There is only the gentle business of letting go. Let your shoulders relax. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest. Let your feet rest. Let the small tensions of the day release themselves, one by one, into the dark. The castles have stood for 900 years. They will stand for the rest of the night. They will be there when you wake. The stones will be in their places. The history will be in its place. You can let go of all of it. You can let go of everything you have heard. You can let go of everything you were thinking before this story began. You can simply rest. Let yourself be carried gently down into sleep, the way a small boat is carried by a slow river towards a quiet sea. There is no hurry. There is no need to think. There is no need to remember anything. The story has been told. The night is long. The bed is soft. The room is dark. Your body is heavy and warm. Your mind is slow and quiet. Sleep is very close now. You can feel it gathering around you, soft and easy, like a thick blanket settling over the day. Let it come. Let it cover you. Let it carry you. Rest now. Rest deeply. Rest well. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. Good night.